Good morning, colleagues and friends. We'll start this conference on the Brown Commission report on constitutional reform in the United Kingdom. The idea behind this conference is to have a civil society engagement with what is an internal political party report on what the British Constitution should look like. And I'm very pleased to introduce our opening speaker, one of the key authors of the report, Professor Jim Gallagher, who has worn many hats, including in business, in civil society, and in the academy. Jim has been a visiting professor at Glasgow University of Law, an honorary professor at the University of St. Andrews, and a fellow at Nuffield College, Oxford. He's also had a previous career as a UK civil servant in Edinburgh and at Whitehall, including as head of Scottish Justice Department, private secretary to two secretaries of State for Scotland, and twice a member of Number 10 Policy Unit in London. So we have a very accomplished speaker who will introduce the report for us. Jim, over to you.
I think the angel Gabriel couldn't have introduced me better, so I'm trying not to disappoint. But thank you for that, and thank you, Sharon, not merely for the kind introduction, but for organising this event, because this is an important and timely subject with which to engage. As Sharon says, I am by trade a public servant. I'm an academic by courtesy, but I've enjoyed time in the institutions mentioned, and I'm now at St. Andrews, and in each of them, my personal strongest interest has been in what you might call the territorial constitution of the United Kingdom. How is power distributed across the geography of this state, and what are the consequences of that? And for the last 2 years, it's been a further privilege for me to work with Gordon Brown and the Commission on the Future of the UK, which the Labour Party set up. And I have to take some of the blame for the recommendations in it. What I want to do in 20 minutes or so, if I got my time right, is give you not a full explanation of the report, because it is, of course, far too long, but why I want to explain why it's got the shape it has, why it's turned out like that, and what lies behind the rather interesting bundle of recommendations there. Because it is a bundle, and it contains stuff which is substantially economic policy, and it contains stuff which is constitutional policy, but it is not a complete economic strategy for the UK, nor is it a complete constitutional reform programme. So those of you who are constitutional anarchs, you wouldn't be here if you weren't, will have plenty to worry about afterwards, even if we implement all of this. So you might wonder, well, why does it have this shape? And the Commission's view, and I certainly think that this is right, is that there are two huge issues for the UK as a polity and as a society, which are linked and need to be addressed together. And they're pretty serious. One is that our economic system is broken, and it isn't working for most of the population. And the other one is that our political system isn't working and is broken for most of the population. And actually, both of those problems have geographical roots, and they have to be addressed at the same time. So I'm going to show you some pictures. And it's not death by PowerPoint, don't worry. That's the front cover of the report. But let me start with the economics. Very simple. The UK has had, how does this work, a decade of economic stagnation. I'm not going to bore you with all the data, but this just compares what's happened over a long period of decades, decade by decade, to the economy. And the numbers are there. You can look at them for yourself. But what we've had in the last decade, bluntly, is a lost economic decade. And that matters for the numbers in the economy. You'll see it in all sorts of data. But actually, in my view, more important, it matters for people's lives and obviously for public services. You can't quite see, but there's pretty bad news happening on life expectancy and whether the kids can read and write. So this is pretty serious stuff. And underlying it, however, there's an economic problem, which is one of three things and I'm going to tell you today that you already know, but that most of us have got so used to, we've ceased to realize how serious they are. And this is the first one. And that is that the UK is the most geographically unequal country, in the developed world. We've got so used to the idea of a north-south divide that we think that that is a natural law. And the fact that it's been getting bigger and worse and more damaging, it's just, well, one of those things that happens. It's actually a profound social and economic problem. I'm just showing you GDP data here, so it's really tedious, but it shows you the ratio between the poorest and the richest regions, and our ratio is bigger than any other big countries. But you can see it in everything else. You can see it in the economic measures. You can see it in incomes. You can see it in household incomes and personal incomes. You can see it in economic activity. But much more seriously, you can see it in things like life expectancy, health status, economic achievement, social mobility, all those things, the huge social effects of geographical inequality. It's actually the largest in the developed world. Most countries have poor places. The United Kingdom has a poor half, or arguably a poor 3/4. We have a very, very wide differentiation. And it's obvious, it's a trivial point that no one seems to make very often. If you insist on concentrating all the economic growth in one corner of the country, the bottom right-hand corner, as an economy as a whole, you are not going to be successful because 3/4 of the economy isn't going well. So that's the first thing that we all knew and we all rather take for granted. Geography has this huge economic significance and social significance in the UK. Actually, it's easy to be lost in the financial numbers. But one factoid has stuck with me from this work. If you are a child on free school meals in London, you are more likely to go into higher education than a child on free school meals in a poor region of the country. Being poor in a poor place turns out to be harder than being poor in the rich place. So I'm claiming that this is a fact that we've all taken for granted, but actually the population have noticed. In the wrong way. This is polling which a think tank I chair had commissioned, and we asked people what they think makes you successful in life. We asked it region by region, as you can see. Well, folks understood that working hard and being well educated made you successful. But goodness me, they think that where you live is more important than your talent. They think that where you live is more important than your ethnicity. They think that where you live is more important than your gender for whether you get on in life. And just think about the amount of effort we put into equality on race and gender. We don't do the same for inequality in relation to place. So it's number one thing, and maybe against that background, it's not too surprising that our political system isn't all that popular. But here's the second thing that we all know and should worry about more. And that is the level of trust in our government institutions. Britain's central government and parliament is the least trusted in the developed world. Here's the more terrifying data. This is OECD numbers about the extent to which governments are trusted and whether it's getting better or worse. We're down at the bottom left-hand corner. Great news, guys. We're ahead of Chile. Chile's in the midst of a constitutional crisis. I don't know what's going on in Costa Rica, but it's not looking good. Colombia's not doing very well. Every developed country has either more trust than us, or trust which is not declining as fast as ours. Not so sure about the Australians, mind you, but we'll come back to that later, perhaps. So the trust in British government is a deeply worrying problem. Now, it would be good to be able to blame all this on bad Boris, right? To say this is just about politicians' behaviour. And some of it is, and we need to do something about that. And there's some material in the Commission report on that subject, and we'll be discussing it later. But it's actually much more structural and long-term. This was an issue before Boris was around, and it's been an issue which has developed over some periods of decades. And it's actually about the distance between government and the governed. I mean the geographical distance, because you ask who is actually trusted in the UK, and you find what you might expect, that levels of political power which are closer to the people they serve, geographically closer, are more trusted. So if there are any local councillors in the room, give yourself a pat on the back. Local councillors are the most trusted all across the place. I won't bore you with the typology of which groups we've done here, but it's clear. And if you have a middle level of government, a devolved level of government, or a mayoral level of government in England, they're pretty trusted too. Pretty bad news for members of the House of Lords, unfortunately. And MPs aren't doing very well either. The bad news for me is that civil servants aren't all that trusted either. So, but this is a geography problem. So, where people have government closer to them, they are more likely to trust it. And that takes me to the third big fact that we all know and tend not to see the significance of. And that is that the UK is the most centralised governmental system, again, pretty well in the developed world. All sorts of ways of measuring this one, lots of anecdotal stuff. But here's a set of simple numbers. It is the proportion of tax and spend, which is held at the centre or decentralised in a range of countries. We're the red blob, the size of the blob is population. We are the most centralised on various measures, not least because this data understates the extent of decentralisation in the UK, because what is formally decentralised to English local government isn't decentralised at all. It's heavily constrained by the centre. So the key point of the diagnosis that lies behind the Commission report is this. It's not a coincidence that we're the most geographically unequal country and the most centralised state. It's not an accident, those two together. And it's not an accident that we're the most centralised state and have the least trusted central politics. And if you're going to address those questions, you have to do some pretty serious things on the economy and on the constitution. I'll explain why each of those and why the particular things we recommend. First, there is manifestly a missing level of government in England. We haven't had successful regional government for a long time. We've got the seeds of one now in the mayor and combined authority model. If you're going to Dublin, you wouldn't start from it, but it's what we've got. And it's the thing, in our view, that you should build on. And it needs to do two things. It needs to lead regional economic development. Our model of economic development is bust, which is supercharge London, hope something trickles down. That doesn't work. Our model of economic development needs to be find the local thing that works and support it locally. So you need to decentralise rather than centralise economic development. And if anybody's interested in that, there's a whole other seminar. I did that earlier in the week. And second, it needs to rebuild the political connection with the local population. And to make this happen, to make sure that this happens and stays happen, we have to do something about the central political culture in the UK. It's not merely a question of doing what we see at the moment of Whitehall gaily contracting with this mayor or with that combined authority. and not really devolving power at all. We have to break the central culture of control and its obsession with sovereignty. And that's a constitutional change. And there was a dangerous red under the bed, a radical of the most profound sort, who diagnosed this in the 1970s. His name was Quintin Hogg, Lord Hailsham. Right? And Hogg's diagnosis was absolutely spot on. He said that the principle of the UK Constitution was one of elective dictatorship. Whoever controls a majority in the House of Commons can do more or less whatever he or she likes. And they certainly think so. I offer you Boris Johnson as the example and the justification for this argument. House of Commons controls the government controls all of the executive system, the government controls the Commons in legislative terms, and if the law stops them doing something, they can change the law. This is a profound central culture, and we have to break it. And that, oddly enough, is the driver for the most controversial of the recommendations in the Brown Commission report, reform of the Second Chamber of Parliament. It's not that the House of Lords is indefensible. I don't think we would try to defend it. It's not that it's ludicrously big, though 800. It is manifestly far too big. It's not that it's got the wrong people in it or is appointed in the wrong way, though appointing folk by a mixture of birth, anointment, and being chums of the Prime Minister is a really strange way to choose your legislators. It's not actually any of those things that drove this recommendation. It's the realization that there's a different task that needs doing, which is to put some constitutional style constraints on the centre of government in order that power is distributed both geographically and in other ways in the United Kingdom. It's doing something about the elective dictatorship. And that means that the Second Chamber, and we have quite detailed proposals for what it should do, needs a degree of electoral legitimacy. And that's why in this report, we've been focusing on the function of a reformed Second Chamber and are surprisingly relaxed about who's in it and how they get there. In a sense, you know, we're up for argument on that, for consultation. Of course, it has to be electorally legitimate. Yep. But there's a number of ways you might do that. There's potential for a mixture of direct and indirect, and no doubt there are some folk who will keep arguing for a number of appointed experts. The key is what it does. And the reason we haven't reformed the House of Lords for a long time in the UK is that we've never been clear what the wretched thing should do. And this proposition is a way of achieving, we don't use these words in the report, but an academic colleague of mine said it's the best description, and I've come to agree with him. What we're recommending here is the form of political entrenchment, seeking to achieve through this political means, taking for granted the supremacy of Parliament, the kind of entrenchment of constitutional provision that other jurisdictions get through having them written down in a solemn constitutional document. It's all a bit Dicey. This question also of devolving power is what lies behind another recommendation, which is not really on our agenda for today, but given the nature of the centre, I ought to give it a mention, and that is the creation of certain social rights which have a degree of constitutional protection. This is, of course, to some degree driven by the desire to give people social rights. It's, after all, a Labour Party document. But actually, the real driver of this is, once again, to enable the decentralisation of power. If you are absolutely clear about what it is that the central state will do, whether that is on the economy or on social provision, then you can be pretty relaxed about saying, well, we'll decentralise this or that or the next thing. And so some social rights are a way of providing a floor and a guarantee, and actually stopping a left of centre government become centralising as well. So there's a great deal more in this report that I could discuss, but I better not. There's lots of stuff on devolution in Scotland and Wales. There's some interesting ideas, though I set myself on decentralisation for England, including some taken straight from the 19th century. But let me focus just finally on two things. The first is what I would rather crudely call cleaning up politics. We have a problem. We have to accept that. This is another of, in a sense, of these issues that have crept up on us over the frog has been boiled slowly. But the behaviour in our political system would have are things which should have caused outrage to the governments I worked for in Westminster and Whitehall 20 and 30 years ago. They would not have been. They would have been regarded. Each individual instance would have been a huge and major scandal. So we have to do something about what, Taryn, you've referred to as the guarantor institutions. There's a lot in there. I'm not going to look at it in detail, but the systems we've got for ensuring that the public can trust public life aren't contributing to that. We've got some interesting ideas for that. One of them is not institutional, and that is a straightforward ban on MPs having another job at the same time. You might let dentists keep doing it in order to keep their professional regulation up, but they've got a job, right? Public are paying them to do a job. They shouldn't have another one at the same time. And bluntly, most of those jobs are improper. They're jobs which are gained because they're an MP, not because they're much use at anything else. And then some changes in the institutional structure. Yeah, another thing that is blindingly obvious, but we take for granted, there is a gross conflict of interest in the system of regulating the behaviour of ministers. The Prime Minister writes a thing called the Ministerial Code, which tells them what right and wrong is. He appoints somebody who, at his request, may make a recommendation on whether they've broken it. He then decides on whether they've broken it, and if so, they deserve any penalty. This is, on any view of the world, a conflict of interest. It's like the Stuart Kings. It's the Prime Minister as the font of justice. And it descends into complete farce when it's the Prime Minister himself who's under investigation. So the Ministerial Code, at least as far as it relates to standards and propriety, needs to be taken out of the hands of the executive and put into the control, I think, of Parliament, possibly involving the second chamber in some way. And the job of the Prime Minister's advisor on standards, oh my, what a job. It was never coherent or sensible, and it should be replaced by an independent investigator and recommender, again, probably to Parliament. So that's a whistle-stop tour of a report which is about twice as long as it needs to be, but you know the excuse for that. What happens now? And we're going to talk about that. As far as the Commission is concerned, it's done its job, it's delivered. And when Keir Starmer launched the report in Leeds at the back end of last year, he committed the Labour Party to implementing it, but it was in government and after a bit of consultation. Formally speaking, I think we're still going through the Labour Party's Byzantine internal policy-making processes. I have had the privilege of attending a couple of meetings of things that I didn't know what was going on at. But there we are, nobody else knew, so it was all right. And there will be that for consultation both before and I'm pretty sure after the election if Labour win. It's certainly not possible to make changes of this magnitude, particularly in relation to the second chamber, without an absolutely clear manifesto commitment, for example, to reform the Lords. Otherwise, the Lords will just say no, and we have to rely, one hopes, on the Salisbury, as we call it now, the Salisbury-Edison Convention, and there are some nuclear options that would be available to a government if the House of Lords were particularly difficult. But there's a great deal in this report around which consensus could and should be built. If you're describing and trying to capture in statute, and a constitutional statute at that, what the purpose of the central state as opposed to the rest of the state is, you want to build consensus on that. If you're creating a second chamber, which is a new constitutional function, We want the maximum consensus on who's in it, how they're elected, how long they serve, and the Commission were very clear that we left that open so that there could be consensus built. If you're going to create some social rights that describe what the central state guarantees, you want some consensus on those, and we were absolutely clear that we only guaranteed things that were already guaranteed so that there could be consensus around them. So a process of consultation and all that's highly desirable, and the kind of conversations that you're going to have today will be an important part of that. And I thank you for having them, and me.
Well, thank you very much, Jim, and thanks very much for being willing to come and open this conference talking about this very important report, which when Karen and I read it, we felt that it's a fascinating report. Firstly, it's fascinating to comparative constitutional lawyers, the way it starts with the problem as a political and economic problem. Often comparative constitutional lawyers think about structures, we think about legal design, but we don't start with the economy. And I think the intertwining of the economy and the political phenomena, and you've laid them out again this morning, running through the report, is an extremely important way and appropriate way to start thinking about constitutional reform. And it's not the one that we as comparative constitutional lawyers start, and perhaps that's because we just don't feel very skilled at it. Secondly, it's an enormously rich report. For those of you who haven't had a chance to read it, I strongly recommend that you do read it. It is full of ideas, but it is also, it strikes me, and again, thinking about this in some ways as an outsider who's been much more closely involved in constitutional reform in Southern Africa, it starts me as a way of starting a conversation. There's not much in the report which is about ending the conversation. I again think that's a very appropriate way to start thinking about constitutional reform. Again and again, the report says the details here need further thought, they need further elaboration. And so it was really for those reasons that Taryn and I thought that this was an appropriate opportunity to draw together a range of people from civil society, from practice, from comparative and different jurisdictions to reflect on. We could only select 3 of them. We found it terribly difficult actually to pick out the topics we wanted to talk about. And the first thing we decided not to talk about, because we thought our ignorance would be so very obvious immediately, was the economy. But we wanted to talk about process because that actually is something that is very important, and you've emphasized it in your closing remarks. We wanted to talk about the upper house reform because, again, the proposition that you start with the idea of upper house reform, not from some sort of historical good heavens above, we have people appointed to this from these very bizarre sources, but from what should an upper house do and what needs to be done, struck us as a good way to go. And thirdly, and then we really were torn between the discussions around equality, exclusiveness, and issues around social rights, which again are important in the report. And this question that you have finished on, which is around integrity in public life. And we've opted for the latter. We do have a hope that we may pick up some of the other things in other events. So turning then to the first panel, I should perhaps say at the outset, normally do, that I'm Kato Reed from the Bonavero Institute. For those of you who haven't met, just warm welcome here at the Bonavero. I'm not going to spend much time introducing our panel. The idea will be that each of them will speak for 10 to 15 minutes. We're going to try and be strict about time. And at the end of that, there will be time for Q&A, both to the members of the panel, but also to Jim, who's here with us. So we're going to go in the following order. We're going to start with Hannah White, who's the director of the Institute of Government, and who's been thinking about these things, and will bring in many ways somebody who's very close to the way in which government works in Westminster's view on these proposals. Then we're going to go to Alan Rennick, who's an expert on processes of constitutional reform, has written really interestingly on many publics and examined them and been involved with establishing many publics, but is also the leader of an ESRC project, which is looking at democracy in the UK after Brexit, and has done some very interesting survey work on people's attitudes, which I think basically aligns with the kind of results of the survey that came out from the Commission's work. Then we're going to go to Sylvia Siteo from the University College London Law Faculty, who's also an expert in comparative constitutional law and is going to talk about it from that perspective. And finally, our colleague here, Leah Trueblood, a fellow here, early career fellow here at the Bonavero and a fellow at Worcester College, who has written really important work on referenda and on thinking about process and politics. And so she will finish off. So over to you, Hannah.
Thank you very much. I was told 8 to 10 minutes. So I think,
Okay, well,
Karen's looking more
stick to
comfortable with
what
that.
Karen said.
Thanks so much. Thank you for organising this event today. I think it's really important that we, like us, engage with the ideas that are in the Brown Commission report and start to try to bring our different expertise and perspectives to bear upon it. The exam question for this session, I think, is whether the UK needs to reconsider how it makes constitutional change. And I think, for me, the answer to that is indisputably yes. So the more interesting sort of thing to dig into is how that change needs to happen. What I'm going to say today draws on some work we've been doing at the Institute of Government in partnership with the Bennett Institute in Cambridge. We've been running for about a year now a review, we call it a very grandly review of the UK Constitution. And the way we've approached that task is to recruit for ourselves a very eminent advisory board where we deliberately chose not to recruit academics and sort of thinkers, but what we really went for were what we thought of as constitutional practitioners. So people who in practice had to operate the constitution in their real lives. And Lady Hale is here in the audience, and I know some of our other commissioners are online, and they're really interested to hear the discussion today because many of the issues we've been considering relate to the issues which are going to be brought up today, so it's really useful for us. So we've been working with our advisory board. We've had a series of roundtables around the UK. We've also been privileged to have a whole range of different constitutional scholars and people who write papers for us, which have informed our deliberations. What I'll say today, it draws on our emerging thinking. None of it is final, and actually it'll be really useful to have feedback and to hear the discussion today to inform our thinking. So, how do we go about doing constitutional change? So obviously the Commission talks about the process of constitutional change really from 2 points of view. So it talks about it from the point of view of how we should go about implementing the changes it proposes, and then it talks about it from the point of view of future constitutional change and how that should happen, and talks about the role of the House Lords in that. And I think that it's fair to say, Jim can correct me if I'm wrong, that our thinking with our review aligns very much with the thinking within the Commission. That there are a number of problems with our constitution at the moment, but a couple of them which really speak to this question are the low threshold that we have for doing constitutional change at all in this country, that you just need a simple parliamentary majority. But also the complexity and the inaccessibility of the constitution. The fact that it's located in multiple sources and locations, it's hard for the public to engage and to understand it. That can lead to a level of the public not understanding why the constitution is relevant to their lives, which is where your linking of the constitution to the economy, I think, comes in. And there's a risk that constitutional change and the way the constitution operates is left to sort of a matter of elite interpretation, rather than the public being involved in that process. So in our thinking about what we want to recommend, which, as I say, is really usefully informed by the Brown Commission, we've been thinking very much about how the public engages in the constitutional change process. And I think one of the problem with how we do it at the moment is in some ways encapsulated by the Commission and its process itself. And there's a quote on page 135.
I'm glad you got that far.
Of the Commission, I read it, where you say, there's a case for a UK constitutional convention, but we feel we must make recommendations that can be implemented early in a new Labour administration. Obviously, politically, that's absolutely true, but it points up the difficulty of, when you're coming to constitutional change, inevitably from a political perspective, how you build in the role of the public into that is really problematic, because you exactly said you want your mandate in your manifestos. That means that you can do this stuff that doesn't get held up by all the roadblocks that we know about, and yet that then makes it quite hard to do the involvement of the public that I think is really the key missing element from our sort of constitutional change program. So, and there is a lot of discussion in the Brown Commission about consultation, but there's also, I think, the risk, and I'm sure you would acknowledge this, Jim, is that there's a sense that broadly the outline is there, and we're going to ask people what they think about it, when actually it might be that if you design a process which is sort of genuinely deliberative, that you don't end up with quite the answers that you come to. And if you want to build real public buy-in to the change, there's a risk which that you might not get at, because there's a sense that the public's being presented with something, or would you like this, and then how do you react to it? So I think that's the thing that will have to be grappled with, is how this can genuinely be a process that creates public trust. And I think that's essential both for the change to happen, but also for the change once it's happened, or whatever the various changes are, to be embedded and harder to unpick. Because another problem we have with constitutional change in the UK is a bit of a sort of flip-flopping of, now we've got the Fixed Term Parliaments Act and evil, now we haven't, because they were created for specific purposes or reasons at different times. So what we are trying to think about in coming up with our recommendations is about how to build the public engagement in the Constitution into the process of constitutional change sort of from the start. And we've got, I won't go into it now, but we've got three sort of areas broadly, I would say, we're looking at. So we're looking at how you bring the public more into the parliamentary side of constitutional change, how you bring it into the government side. And we're playing with the idea of a sort of a constitutional authority of some kind. We sort of think of it a bit like an OBR for the Constitution, that would maybe sit outside Parliament, maybe sit within Parliament, maybe be a sort of hybrid body of some kind. But those three elements all needing quite a lot of different sort of changes, we think. And I should say that the sort of approach we think we're taking here is very much not a written constitution, but building and sort of supporting the political constitution that we have, and sort of strengthening that, but building the political involvement across those three areas. So just to give some quick examples, within government, we think that it's really important that people thinking about constitutional change, civil servants, ministers, have a shared understanding of what the Constitution is and how it's supposed to operate. And the complexity of that at the moment makes that quite hard to achieve. That would have benefits for the public as well. So a way in which to make the Constitution more comprehensible would be something very desirable. In terms of Parliament's role in constitutional change, obviously, as I say, there's a lot in the Brown Commission about the role for the Lords there, but I think we also think the role of the Commons in constitutional change is really important, and involving the public by more pre-legislative scrutiny, more public readings, and select committee involvement, inquiries and so on in the passage of bills that might be deemed to be constitutional. We're playing with how you define a constitutional bill, and those difficult questions, so more parliamentary engagement. And then with this sort of constitutional authority, I think the thing that we're very conscious of is the reason that the OBR managed, if you cast your minds back to the autumn, to compare to, and that the OBR became a big player in the economic changes that its trust wanted to bring in, and the fact that their advice hadn't been sought was an issue, and so on. That worked because you had the markets as a sort of external mechanism. And I think if you want a constitutional authority that can play a role in public education, scrutiny, being authoritative, and there's loads of questions around this, and I'd love to get into them, then you have to think, what's that external authority? And I think the external authority has to be the public again, and that has to maybe be via Parliament, but still very nascent. So just to finalise, in terms of what we're thinking about, when we think about public engagement in constitutional change, we think it has to be complementary to representative democracy, but we think that that's essential because it brings legitimacy to that process, which frankly, with political parties where they are now, they're not broadly representative of the public, as we've seen very much with Conservative leadership elections, for example. I think more political public engagement can bring greater legitimacy to these sorts of questions, but it mustn't be tokenistic. It can't be seen as a rubber stamp. And it has to be appropriate. You can't just sort of say, oh, these are the citizens' assemblies. You have to think, is this question we're asking conducive to citizens' assembly, some other process? What is it we're actually trying to achieve here? So I guess to sum up, I think, we think that in the process of constitutional change, the involved, like meaningful engagement of the public is really now beginning to be self-evidently essential. But there is a risk of not doing it right and that ending up being.
Thanks very much, Hannah. Thanks for sticking to your time. It's a quick moment, actually.
Great, thank you, Kate, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. It's great to be part of what I agree is a really important conversation. I fear we're going to do a great deal of agreeing with each other. So I do have taken as my starting point the exam question that we were all set. So the blurb for the panel sets out a constitutional view of the Constitution, according to which a single party majority in Parliament is sufficient to enact major constitutional change. And it asks whether reconsideration of that model is needed. And it also alludes, of course, to the Brown Commission's recommendation that there should be major public consultation, including particularly citizen assemblies on these issues. So that has led me to have three questions in mind when I'm looking at this. So is a single party majority sufficient for major constitutional reform? Should the public be involved? And if so, in response to the second question, what form should such public involvement take? So on that first question, is a single party majority in Parliament sufficient? And Jim alluded to the desire for consensus, which might suggest that the answer to that question is no. And indeed, there are some perhaps fairly obvious reasons for thinking no. The rules of the game clearly should not be decided by one of the teams playing the game. And that is a principle that I think applies particularly to electoral rules. It's rather a curious thing that those who are being elected decide how they're being elected. And indeed, there was some acknowledgement of that fact in the 2011 AV referendum on the motion system. Of course, that referendum happened because compromise between the Conservative and the Dems, but the fact that that was a sort of sensible landing point for compromise reflected the fact that it made sense to think that a referendum is a sensible way of deciding on an issue such as that. But it's also the case that there are many constitutional issues that aren't clearly matters of interest, strong interest to particular political parties. And that relates, I think, to many of the issues that are in the Brown Commission's report. Questions around rights, around devolution, around the structure of the union. These don't clearly relate to the interests of a particular political party. And there are indeed important costs associated with supermajorities. I've generally argued against the introduction of supermajority requirements because they tend to entrench the status quo. And they can encourage a great deal of gameplay in the political realm. So I think it is absolutely right that basic constitutional principles should be, as Hannah has suggested, hard to change. But simply going to supermajority in Parliament isn't necessarily the way to go. So that leads to the second question around should the public be involved? And in a general sense, it seems to me the answer is obviously yes, because the Constitution and the democratic system are there for everyone, not just for those who are at a particular point within that system. In place. Which obviously leads on to the point that politicians collectively are often party group on many of the issues that we're talking about here. And relating to the Brown Commission, very obviously in relation to the recommendations on reforming the standard system and strengthening that standard system, where all politicians or leaders of all parties have interests in not going too far than the direction the Brown Commission suggests. And similarly, if you look at attitudes of MPs to reform of the second chamber, as my colleague Meg Russell has shown in her work, the primary barrier to Lords reform has tended to be the House of Commons, not the House of Lords. The House of Commons is terrified about having a second chamber that actually does things beyond the important role that it does have at the presence of scrutinising the detail of legislation. So politicians clearly are often party creating these issues, but more fundamentally, and again, Jim and Hannah have both alluded to this, trust matters and rebuilding trust in politics is absolutely fundamental. And indeed, the title of the report is A New Britain, and it talks about the need for a vision for a new Britain. And clearly, given how low trust it is in politicians, and our research, as Kate said, very much fits with the research that the Commission did in pointing again to the very low levels of trust and satisfaction in the state of our democracy. You can't just have a politician there clearly in order to consider these issues. It is essential to have deep public involvement. And again, the traditional model that we've had in the UK for recent decades hasn't just been about party majorities in Parliament implementing things. We have had quite a few referendums mainly on questions about territorial structure, which again reflect the idea that public buy-in is. So that leads to the third question, which is what form should public participation take? So I've talked about referendums and citizen assemblies. Citizen assemblies here are examples of continued processes. And these clearly have different roles. So citizen assemblies explore options, they make recommendations. Most experts in citizen assemblies would say they shouldn't be making decisions. And indeed, our research found that the members of the public, both in response to survey questions and when they had deliberated on the issue themselves, felt that citizen assemblies should be making recommendations and should be taken seriously by decision makers, but shouldn't actually be making decisions themselves because of the lack of accountability that is actually one of the fundamental aspects of the design of systems. Whereas referendums also have so they have different roles. Referendums on their own, I think, are clearly inadequate for the purposes that we're discussing here. They offer a take or leave it choice at the end of the process. They often engender very poor quality debate, as we know. I do think they're important for some of the kinds of proposals that the Brown Commission has, and particularly I think those around statement of purpose, national purpose, and rights. It seems hard to see how that could have the kind of legitimacy without the rubber stamp at the end of the process. But it's not enough. It's clearly not enough. So citizens' assemblies are essential, again, embedded within wider processes of public discussion. And so it's great that the Brown Commission talks about those. It's interesting that the Commission, the report talks about a series of citizens' assemblies, which I think, again, is right, because you can't give a single citizens' assembly too big a job. And the job of looking at all of these matters would be too big for a single citizen's assembly. But how do you do a series? We've never actually done one. No one's ever done one. What a series of citizens' assemblies might look like, I think, needs careful attention. So some of the issues that the Commission looks at are fairly discrete. particularly the standard system reforms. So you could simply do that as a standalone. Some of them are local. So one thing that the Commission doesn't really talk about is public involvement in the devolution within England. And it seems to me that, again, public involvement in thinking about what are the areas that should be devolved to would be quite important. But some of the other issues are really big. So the purposes and rights, that's very big. Maybe you could do that in a big citizens assembly. Maybe you would need to divide that up. I'm not quite sure. But certainly, the structure of the union and the second chamber, complicated stuff. So, you could do as a really nice citizens assembly. We've often thought that we might want to do one on second chamber reform. But if you're linking second chamber reform also to the structure of the union, then it becomes much, much more complicated. And with the structure of the union, presumably you need to have various different processes taking place in different parts of the UK that would then come together. And how all of that links up really needs to be thought through very carefully. And then just a couple of final thoughts on citizens' assemblies. What question you put to the citizens' assembly is very important, and Hannah was alluding to this. So you could simply ask a citizens' assembly to endorse a proposal, you could ask it to answer a specific question, or you can ask it to look at a broad range of issues. The Commission, quite rightly, I think, is very clear that it doesn't advocate the first of those things, so it's very clear that its recommendations need further discussion. But just how far you go in simply setting a question that is to be answered, and how far there's flexibility around reshaping the question, thinking about exactly what the question should be, I think that's a big question. And then finally, the link between citizen assemblies, these kinds of deliberative processes, and decision makers, how you design that is fundamentally important as well. As I've said, I don't think many people would advocate a citizens' assembly having decision-making power, but it is essential that it is not just some kind of thing that takes place, and then the real power people don't pay much attention and get on with what they were going to do anyway. So how you do that, I think, is tricky and a good question. So all of this process, if you're going to do the process well, and I think it's fundamentally important to do the process well if you want to have the outcomes that are desired, then you've got to do a lot of hard work. It's going to be quite complicated. And just very final thought, whether a Labour government is going to want to do all of that, I think is an interesting question. I confess that I'm a bit skeptical. So thinking about the kind of quick wins that the government might be able to get seems crucial alongside thinking about it.
Thanks, Ellen. Now we'll turn to Sylvia. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity to reflect on this really interesting report. I think there will be some themes emerging, and there's sort of an overlap between the remarks, but overlaps with you as well. The overarching question that I want to raise in my comments is whether the process as envisioned is fit for purpose, or what questions we need to ask and answer in order to envision it. And by fit for purpose, I mean two things. One, fit for the multi-level constitutional system the UK has and is envisioned to have following the reforms. And second, whether the process would be fit for the substantive constitutional change it is meant to bring about in terms of its scope, in terms of its constitutional nature, and in terms of the principles underpinning it. And I'll try to unpack these as I go. Now, I also noticed, as Alan did, the focus on renewing our democracy in the title of the report and throughout it. And indeed, it will be difficult to achieve that without significant popular buy-in. And the popular legitimation that is envisioned in the report is twofold the way I see it. One, the initial electoral support, electoral consent of the Labour Party on a mandate that explicitly includes constitutional change. And second, this series of citizens' assemblies as part of a ground-up conversation and voting here with the people of Britain on the change they want to be. Now, I'll focus mainly on the citizens' assemblies and popular input, but also return a little bit to electoral legislation as well. end. Now, on citizens' assembly, I think one important question to raise is what aim they're meant to serve. Now, the report seems to refer to them mainly as consultative, but I wonder to what extent that includes an agenda-setting aspect as well. So it's tied to what Ellen was asking about the question that would be asked to people. Is it discrete questions, pre-set questions that they're meant to reflect on, or is there room for openness, for instance, where people taking part in them to add items to the agenda? One example could be to add social rights to the right in the report. And it may also be that the process reveals less appetite for some of the reforms listed in the report, and that should also be taken into account, and space and room should be made for that possibility. Because after all, a citizens' assembly is a deliberative process, a process that encourages reflection at the time, and without adequate information may yield different outcomes than a poll or survey. And on this, I should note, unsurprisingly, the report is not neutral. It explicitly starts from a unionist point of view. It seeks to offer an alternative to Scottish independence. It's described the existing House of Lords as only indefensible, etc. And that makes sense from a political point of view, but from the point of view of a constitutional process and a constitutional or conversation around constitutional change, there needs to be openness to the possibility that people disagree, and to think through what that disagreement, how that disagreement would be addressed and reflected in the outcome. So a truly deliberative stage in the process, I think, needs room for this openness to the possibility that the public, in whole or in part, disagrees with the direction of travel that is in the report. Now, again, on the functions that citizens assembly can play, there are other ones, not just as a consultative with an agenda-setting role. They can play an educational role, beneficial in terms, but they also sometimes can play a deadlock-breaking function, and that is something that might be interesting to add on to, the possible role they might play if, for instance, the political or legislative process gets brought down, or there isn't a clear way out. Then you might have a citizens' assembly to break that. In any case, I think the function that these assemblies are meant to perform must be made very clear to both those taking part in them and to the wider public, which also includes laying out a follow-up to their output. So, this ties back to the issue of public trust, and seeking popular legitimation through public consultation can only engender that public trust if the process is transparent and clear from the beginning, but also its outcomes. So the outcome of that consultation needs to be very, very clear in order for it not to risk turning into mere window dressing or an afterthought. Right. Well, the second big question I want to raise is what timeline are we operating with? And I'll quote from the report toward the end, so page 144, even later than I got to really read it, where it says our report deliberately focuses on change that can be delivered and make a difference in a single parliament to address the UK's immediate constitutional and economic challenges. Other issues that would have to span more than one election cycle can, however, be also discussed, and the example given is now, undoubtedly, these reforms will take a significant time investment and resource investment, even assuming there is unified political will and agreement on the point of departure. And from the point of view of the deliberative exercise envisioned, this is equally true. So with all the preparation that we can do, or the Labour Party could do ahead of the election, there will still need to be time set aside for setting up the citizens' assembly, including membership selection, to allow them to meet repeatedly, to deliberate, to disseminate their outputs to the wider public, to leave time for government to respond, etc. And none of these things can happen before the election. And just to give a comparative example, the Irish examples, I think, range from between 16 and 18 months of the citizens' assembly, and prior to that constitutional convention, deliberating and issuing their reports. With all the preparation, you're looking at obviously longer than that. A related question that has already been addressed is what will these assemblies be expected to deliberate on? And of course, if it's more discrete reforms, it might be easier. If it's big reforms or big interlinked reforms like devolution, chamber reform, that will add to the time requirement. Another question that I think is really important in light of the report's own focus is what is the scale that we're considering here? And relatedly, whose voice is to be heard as part of the assembly? It's very good to acknowledge the need for plural assemblies and for them to take place in multiple locations across the country. But what is the unit of analysis here? So is it to be one or several for Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland? Is what do you do with England? We heard Jim speaking of the missing level of governance in England, and then the report, of course, discussed the different devolution options for England, and also emphasizes the importance of local authority. But what exactly, for instance, the unit of the political community to be represented by a citizens' assembly in England and beyond is unclear and will need some careful thinking. And one thing to note here is that the choice could be one that reflects existing arrangements, or it could be one that reflects the intended future arrangements. And then that becomes, that throws in more an extra political information. And just to note here that how this issue is resolved brings in, again, the risk of fragmentation and the risk of disagreement. So if you are truly to set up public consultations across the country in different regions and different units, there needs to be careful planning for what happens if they disagree fundamentally. So not just about the detail of it, but less on the direction of travel, but what if they disagree fundamentally? What happens to that disagreement? And is there thinking of how to get buy-in, how to get the ones who don't see their options eventually reflected in the constitutional reform to reach? I won't say very much about the process of selection for these citizens' assemblies, except to note that the report focuses on or understands diversity and inequality, discusses it very much from the geographic point of view. And there's a reason for that. We've heard that in Jim's remarks. That hasn't properly been addressed by structures and ways of working until now. But of course, all the other markers of diversity are still there, and they are also markers of inequality. So thinking of gender inequalities, race inequalities, etc., needs to come back in also when considering public consultation. It's not just geographic representation that needs to be taken into account. And finally, on citizens' assemblies, I would raise the question of what comparators we are, inform the work of the report or will inform their design. There aren't really examples given, more often it's a parish example that is on people's mind. There's some examples given at the local level, but to flag that such a series of citizens' assemblies on the scale and with the scope and invited to reflect on the nature of constitutional change envisioned here hasn't been before. So there is, quite a bit of innovation. Do I still have some time to say a few things on?
You're running out, so
Okay.
two sentences.
Two sentences. Oh, sentence number one. It's quite unusual, I think, in comparative terms, to see proposals for such far-reaching constitutional change channeled through legislation. Anywhere else, you see this as a big C, constitutional moment, and indeed the report speaks of a constitutional moment. The danger here is that by overemphasizing the legislative track, that constitutional moment risks ending up looking like more of the same. And final sentence, no referendums envisioned. It feels like there's a popular legitimation gap at the upward stage. So you have the electoral legitimation, you have some public consultation, but then nothing in the way of a national opportunity to ratify or somehow validate the contours, the details of the change that is envisioned. It doesn't have to be a referendum. It could be an intervening electoral cycle. It could be supermajorities, which have their own risks, but it could also be other ways to seek to build cross-party consensus. Think of cross-party committee work in Parliament, etc. But I think if this is truly to be a process that changes the political and constitutional culture, it also needs to model that change and to go beyond.
Thank you. Very good concluding.
Thanks, Kate. Well, good morning, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here with these really impressive people to talk about this really impressive report. And I'm mainly going to be offering cheer review of what's already been said, agreeing with these amazing folks. So we've been tasked with responding to recommendation 40, which says the necessary consultation and preparatory work for these reforms should begin now. This included ground-up conversation with the people of Britain, and citizen assemblies are mooted. So I have 3 thoughts about recommendation 40, and what connects my thoughts are the differences between persuasion and consultation and ratification. And I think all these processes are essential for constitutional change, but they're different and they require different tools. So first, I agree with the report that a ground-up conversation is required. You can't prescribe this kind of, incredibly ambitious and exciting decentralized power in a centralized way. That doesn't make sense. But like my colleagues, I wonder about citizen assemblies at the countrywide level is the answer to that. I'm more excited about their use at the local level, and I'll say more about that. Second, now when we move to exciting conferences like conversations like this one, I think the intention could usefully change to get people on board who disagree, or give those who even disagree with the report some reason to support its outcome. And if that support isn't achieved, that kind of political entrenchment, that Jim talked about isn't going to exist. So I'm going to talk about building cross-party support. And the third point is about referendums. I agree with my colleagues, given how ambitious some of the proposals are about, for example, the House of Lords, for example, the Fresh Start. I think referendums are required, but they have to be seen as primarily as tools of ratification. So I'm going to offer these thoughts in the context of a belabored story about being a new parent, to keep it light. So I learned more about persuasion and ratification and consultation while trying to dress my toddler this morning than I did in 3 years of law school. So there was this glorious time about a month ago. I said, "Teddy Bear, do you want to wear the red trousers or the blue trousers today?" That he'd be like, "The blue trousers." And that illusion of autonomy was enough to get out the door on time. But he quickly realized the key law school premise of tactic of rejecting the premise of the question. So now he just grabs both pairs of trousers and runs towards the door. In fact, he could, "Oh, I told you everything you need to know about constitutional change, but it tells you something important." And what it reminds me of is the need to distinguish between persuasion and consultation and ratification. So the question I think right now for the Labour Party is the right balance of these 3 processes. And I think it wasn't totally clear to me what balance the Labour Party wanted to take, understandably, from reading the report, particularly given recommendation 1. So recommendation 1 says the political, social, and economic purposes of the UK as a union of nations, which the overwhelming majority of people in the country already accept, should be laid out in a new constitutional statute guiding how political power should be shared. And my interest is in the word union. So I think union can mean all kinds of things. And I think the report is completely right that there's a broad acceptance that the United Kingdom is a union, but I'm not sure that there is acceptance of a particular meaning of union. So I think the question for us on recommendation 40, given recommendation 41, as I say, is how much the Labour Party wants to persuade the country of this vision of constitutional reform versus establish, a ground-up vision that they think voters want. And to put my own cards on the table, I'm really excited by these recommendations. I don't think Labour should now embark on a 3-year process of proving that every person in this country thinks this is the right way to go. I think they should show leadership and make the case for this exciting decentralized one for very good reasons. Jim said at the top about inequality. I don't think there's anything undemocratic about that. I think that's what politics is for. It's for showing leadership and what you think is right. So on my view, I think the balance of persuasion and consultation should be something like 80% persuasion on the ends, or the big picture vision of this joint renewal of the economy and the constitution, and 20% consultation on the means or the mechanics. and about the right tools to achieve this broader persuasive vision forward. So as I say on citizen assemblies, I can't improve on, what the best people in the world to ask about this. Sylvia and Alan said, I think citizen assemblies are really good for recommendations. So getting what you want to, I think, use them for, as Alan says, is to get out of the ordinary political day-to-day process. And that's what has already been achieved by amazing folks like Jim and Gordon Brown. So they're very good, I think, coming up with recommendations, but they aren't really, I think, tools either of persuasion or consultation or ratification. So their legitimacy comes from the ordinaries of their members, and their members not being regular politicians, the Alan says, not people who play by the rules of the game, not making the rules. So, but I think there are other tools that could be used. So using things like, I think the logic instead should be using these at a local level, or using even more diffuse processes, using the logic of the report to make the processes ground up and informal and decentralized as possible. Things more like town halls or iterative polls or online forums or websites where people can send ideas, or setting up a granting system where if I want to run a citizens jury or a citizens assembly locally, I can do that. So there's local demand to think about, implementing change in East Yorkshire, and there's support for them to do that on the how question without compromising on the big picture, a why question. And I'm a bit worried about, for all the very good reasons my colleagues have said about what's the purpose, given you already have a set of recommendations of the citizens assembly that the country might. And I just think the Labour Party's got lots of friends here, that they could usefully. So moving on to my second point about cross-party support. When we're doing constitutional change, we're not doing everyday politics, we're doing something different. And I think the Labour Party has lots of friends here that could help it. Surely the Lib Dems would be excited, to be invited, or the Green Party. But in 2019, Lord Strathclyde, the former Conservative leader in the Commons, said we need a stronger, more responsible second chamber, more directly accountable to the people. Or even Manir Ritzer, former Johnson advisor, Civic Future Initiative, to try to get new and different people across the country into politics. So I think going forward, when we think about recommendation 40 and building up to the next election, I think on these proposals, it's really important for their legitimacy and this political entrenchment Jim rightly emphasized to reach out across parties. Because the aim of constitutional change is to get to a point where people who disagree with you still have some reason to support it. So as Hannah says, we're not going back and forth in the European Union, out of the European Union. I think we need something more fundamental to achieve political entrenchment, and cross-party support is I think has to be the intention going forward. But particularly given that something citizen assemblies can do is establish cross-party legitimacy at the country level. But if we're sort of past that stage, I think we need to think about other ways to do that. And third, I think while the requirement to hold a referendum on something like House Law probably isn't a constitutional convention, I think it is probably a constitutional expectation particularly after the AB referendum in 2011, where people were given the opportunity to weigh in on a change to how, the mechanism of representation. Well, more importantly, I think it's just a good idea because that's the main tool of political entrenchment we have in the United Kingdom. And I think if Labour don't think they can win or have time to hold a referendum, they shouldn't make these changes. I think that's the kind of political entrenchment required for something so profound. So I'm going to conclude by returning to my protracted parenting metaphor to try to justify it. It's hard to make constitutional change. It's hard to leave the house with a small child. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do either of these things. You probably need to do both these things to survive. I can see half the people in the audience, nodding. So I hope Labour don't give up on the dream of leaving the house sometimes. And I hope they hold on to the ambition of the report. I hope they prioritize persuasion over consultation. I know it comes from a good place, to seek consultation, but I hope they prioritize persuasion over consultation and make the case to everyone, even though we disagree with them, for this really powerful vision of the Constitution where power is decentralized.
Thanks, Leah. That's a really interesting way to end on that political leadership and houses. Karen is going to be a discussion for us.
Thanks very much. That was a really rich first panel, and I'm perhaps more on Leah's team than the others here, and we'll start by introducing some discordant notes to colleagues who are largely sympathetic to public involvement, engagement, and consultation, and perhaps. This skepticism comes from coming from a much more deeply divided society, India and worrying about making the constitution making process a lot more majoritarian and its consequences, especially for excluded minorities. So the excitement over citizens' assemblies around the world and its embrace by scholars, including very influential scholars like Helen Landemore from Yale, worries me about its consequences for groups who will lose out in those processes, especially in deeply divided societies, but not just in deeply divided societies. And I'm thinking about issues like the death penalty here, issues like immigration, and how citizens' assemblies in the UK might decide on those concerns. So I think who is doing the agenda setting, and whether this, so Leah's questions about this, whether this is about persuasion or whether this is about actually decision making and thinking about what we want to do is key. I also want to make a distinction between inclusion in the constitution making process and public participation. And this is something that has come up in a lot of exercises, especially in Sri Lanka and more recently in Chile, where it seems to be emerging, or at least some scholars are beginning to question an unreserved endorsement of the idea that greater public participation is an unqualified good. What is an unqualified good is greater inclusion of every salient social, economic, and political group in that society, especially through their elites, through their leaders. That it's important that every important group has a veto power in the constitution making process, that nobody leaves empty-handed, because an unspent political force is extremely dangerous for a democracy. But so that you give a reason to every group to play by the rules and not outside it. But public participation is a lot more complicated, and I worry about it. I know from British eyes this looks like a bizarre skepticism, because our process is so centralized, and every party that has lived in the opposition for more than a decade comes with its own agenda to overhaul the constitution. This is what we have seen the last 30 years. But this is a note of caution of not moving completely to the opposite extreme, and I wonder what colleagues here think, especially in light of the comparative experience. So perhaps that is a question, more general question addressed to everyone. More specific points. I was thinking about the worry that Alan highlighted about you don't want constitutions to be made by single-party majorities, but you also don't want American-style dysfunction with supermajority requirements, because that is a recipe basically for neoliberalism. A government that does nothing is a neoliberal government, and when it entrenches the status quo, it entrenches political power. So again, from a comparative perspective, there are ideas that can be tried. So the Thai model, for example, of weighted multipartisanship, where you have a simple majority requirement to enact constitutional legislation or electoral reform, but that majority must be constituted by at least 30% of the opposition members, right? So it's not a supermajority requirement, but it does demand that the government reaches out to and secures the buy-in of a part of the opposition to get behind its proposal, which sort of is an inbit. So anyway, there are multiple design tools that avoid the dysfunction of supermajorities while allowing or requiring multipartisan involvement. I think Sylvia already touched upon one of the problems of an English citizen assembly and a Scottish citizen assembly is deadlocking, and how do you resolve that? So I'm not going to repeat that, but a bigger worry is this: that when you're doing comprehensive, well, if this is not a comprehensive root and branch proposal, but it is quite widespread, and it touches upon many aspects of a constitution. Citizens' assemblies, especially issue-based citizens' assemblies, are a particularly bad way of doing constitutional reform with too many moving parts. Again, comparative experience suggests that successful constitutions are those that everybody in the Constituent Assembly hated, or if not hated, disliked. That you don't have anybody who got everything they wanted. But they disliked it only so much that they could all hold their noses and sign up to it, right? And that idea of a compromise package that everybody hates, but everybody is able to sign up to. You can't achieve that through a citizens' assembly mechanism, especially when it's issue-based, because a compromise package requires optimization and compromise and consensus building between multiple moving parts. Okay, we didn't win there. Can you give us a win here, right? We might have lost out on devolution. Can we win on electoral systems, right? But issue-based citizen assemblies will seek to maximize rather than optimize on their particular issues. And then, I think the task of whoever's job it is to put all those best options together in a package will be an impossible one. And it might actually make the process designed to fail because each of those assemblies will come up with their best packages, their best demands, and doing compromise after that, once the citizens have spoken, will be politically next to impossible when you have to detract on almost every major process. So I think this idea of actually, getting the citizens' assemblies to come up with the proposals rather than to persuade and to ratify, if the process has to be meaningful and achieve something, I think that has to be really borne in mind. And finally, I think on Leah's ideas, I think you touched upon this. I think the motivation in the report is a good one, and I think a lot of the people in the room will sign up to it. But there is a deep tension between. So now I'm also arguing against myself, between using public engagement purely for persuasion, while the agenda setting is clearly party partisan. As in, the Labour Party is not putting these proposals up simply because of the good of the country. It is also going to help the party, maybe a helpful bonus, right? So how do you create a common cross-partisan program that can be signed up to, not by all Tories, but enough Tories for this to have a nationwide legitimacy, without making the public engagement simply a rubber stamp role? And here, I think the Chileans have an important lesson for us. When you go gung-ho on seeking, perhaps ideologically cleaner options with a very partisan citizens' assembly, that ends up not working, because you also need not just moral legitimacy for the reform, but you have to take the country together, and that it includes people on the other side. And I think, and the final thought I'll end with is, because you mentioned the AV referendum, that is also maybe my final conclusion is that this is all too complicated, right? But that is also a recipe for how not to do things, right? That was a substantively good idea killed by badly designed process and a government that played. It was sort of democracy used to kill the deepening of democracy, or getting turkeys to vote for Christmas, right? But it really would have been better for a much more democratic United Kingdom. But the referendum was used at a time, scheduled at a time when Nick Clegg's popularity was at rock bottom, to tie the proposal with the popularity or lack thereof to a particular politician, right? So I think all of these powers, agenda setting powers, scheduling powers, who decides, how many people decide, all of that will be relevant. But anyway, I think I'll stop there and leave some time for Q&A as well. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Taran, and I'm very grateful for you to make sure that we're not going to please here. And I think it really illustrates how difficult this is and how many questions there are wound up there. There's the agenda and setting the agenda. There's the process of, as Leah put it, persuasion, consultation, and communication, all wound into the process. I'm sure that.
Well, welcome everyone to our discussion of the second chamber and electoral system reform issues in the Commission's report. I want to thank Taran, by the way, and the Bonavero Institute for bringing us together. And I find this exciting, particularly because of my colleagues who will be speaking. From my left, the Honourable Justice Matthew Palmer is a judge of the New Zealand High Court, former senior civil servant and academic, who I'm glad to say is visiting Oxford this term. Gavin Phillipson is Professor of Law at the University of Bristol Law School. Jeff King is Professor of Law in the Faculty of Laws at UCL. Michaela Heilbronner, a visitor at the Bonavero, is Professor of German and International Public Law and Comparative Law at the University of Munster. And Hayley Hooper is Associate Professor of Law at Harris Manchester College, Oxford. The Commission recommends that the House of Lords should be replaced with a new second chamber of Parliament, an Assembly of the Nations and Regions. The new second chamber should complement the House of Commons with a new role of safeguarding the UK Constitution, subject to an agreed procedure that sustains the primacy of the House of Commons. And the new second chamber must have electoral legitimacy and should be markedly smaller than the present Lords, chosen on a different electoral cycle with the precise composition and method of election matters for consultation. I find it striking that the report says that what these recommendations will do, they will clear out the indefensible House of Lords and replace it with a smaller, more representative and democratic second chamber to safeguard the new constitutional basis of the New Britain. And in my view, if this comes about, the title of the report, New Britain, will be a fitting title. It'll be a remarkable transformation of this country, in my view. But as the report points out, it's not a new idea. The report reminds us of the preamble to the Parliament Act 1911, whereas it is intended to substitute for the House of Lords as it at present exists, a second chamber constituted on a popular instead of hereditary basis, but such substitution cannot be immediately brought into operation, ... Well, here we go. I find, I'm not here to comment, I'm going to hand over to the panelists, but I find something attractive in the idea that it might be good if the second chamber had political legitimacy. And that's against the grain of much thinking in politics and in constitutional law in this country that thinks that it would be a dangerous organization if it had political legitimacy. So let's see what can be done in assessing the danger and the potential in the report's proposals to make the second chamber of our parliament legitimate. The panelists are going to speak for it says 8 to 10 minutes. I'm going to treat that as a strict limit of 10 minutes each, including Matthew, who is down as discussant. I don't know if that makes it mandatory for him to discuss what the others have said, but at least makes it permissible. And so 10 minutes each, that's all. I will actually be a nuisance if it goes past 10 minutes, because we want you people to be involved in discussing the issues and in discussing what our panelists have to say. We'll start with Jeff.
Thank you very much. So it is a great pleasure and honor to be able to comment on these commission proposals, and in particular on an issue I haven't had a chance to comment on. So unlike some commentators, I'm not hostile to these proposals, and I admire the reformist spirit that animates them. However, I have a significant degree of ambivalence about them, founded on a concern that they could weaken the crucial role that's now played by the House of Lords. I want in the next few minutes to draw on things that I noticed in my experience in advising the Select Committee in the House of Lords, the Constitution Committee, that suggests to me certain problems thrown up by these proposals. And then more constructively, I want to outline some options for addressing. So I'll begin with a few remarks on what I consider to be the improbable virtues of the House of Lords as it's currently composed. It's known to be a chamber which has a strong record in the areas of legislative scrutiny, contributions of its select committees, reporting on constitutional issues, both in the legislative scrutiny process as well as in inquiries and other ways outside of it. The government has to contend with the Lords when it presents bills for passage. All of these are known things, so I won't expand on them right now. I feel like the role of the Lords is a bit like the flight of the bumblebee. It's improbable, it's hard to explain in rational terms, but it happens. I want to address what I see as the virtues of this competence. Why does it exist? Why is it perceived in that way? And how are those virtues affected by the reform? And I'll outline 7 key features of the institutional setup in the Lords that I think accounts for why they play this important role. First, no overall control by any party. No party controls the chamber as a whole, and there's a very significant and vocal cross-bencher element. There's no elective dictatorship in play in the Lords. Second is perspective. Most members are late in their careers. Even those nominated by parties will often have a different perspective from their fellow members in the Commons, being 20 years on from being an MP. They often give a long-term view. Thirdly, time and focus. In my experience, the peers I've met read the papers. In the Constitution Committee, they have 100-page plus packages of dense memoranda in addition to the bills that were up for scrutiny, and it would be read. My impression is that MPs more generally want the elevator pitch. They're busier, and political salience is always driving their attention, and it provides a distraction from some of the technocratic elements. Fourthly is competence. Parties don't just nominate anyone or any MP, and they're generally of high caliber, but they don't even just draw any MP. They sometimes nominate the wrong people to the chamber. However, they very often nominate eminent persons in their parties, ones that have contributed a lot to public policy or have a distinguished record of public service, scholarly achievement, or achievement in the world of trade and commerce. Not to mention a large number of officials, such as former cabinet secretaries, clerks of the House of Commons and Parliaments, senior ex-civil service, and law lords, among many others. These persons have experience in discerning judgment. It is often weighty. And crucially, since they have often served in or around government, they can offer a counterpoint to arguments the government presents that something is just necessary. Fifthly, control of timetable. No timetabling of legislation in the courts. Public bills are taken in either in the committees of the whole House or in grand committee where any member can attend and speak. That's a threat to business managers for the government who want to get legislation quickly through both houses. Harold Wilson famously said that a week is a long time in politics. Try 6 months. Sixthly is independence from whips. The main reason, as far as I can tell, for this independence is that appointments are for life. That means that members, they don't have to, face the prospect of another election. And lastly, and this is critical, is the power of delay. When the Lords don't pass a bill, they put wrecking amendments in on it. It can lead to a showdown that's intensively scrutinized by media, and it can really slow down the government's legislature. That's real power. Now, I want to repeat, I am not against House of Lords, not in the slightest. I see fundamental constitutional reform and constitution. But I feel that the proposals in the Commission report are, in a way, a threat to several of these virtues as well. And I'll go down the list again. No overall control. If the Assembly of Nations and Regions is appointed on a first past the post system, there'll probably be outgoing limits, that is overall majorities or coalitions. If there's proportional representation, there will be coalitions. The different electoral cycle could make a difference, but I feel that coalitions and party loyalties will be a constant threat to the idea of no overall control of the chamber. Secondly, perspective. Elected members will not likely be in the twilight of their careers, and the whip is likely to be more relevant to their future. Thirdly, with time and focus, elected members have constituency work and elections to fight and whips to account to. With competence, we would lose the appointed peers on this proposal, people of incredible ability who really have influence in the House on a cross-party basis. Former cabinet secretaries, individuals like Lord Panic, Lord Lisbane, former clerk of Parliament, Lord Anderson, Igor Judge, law lords, former party grandees who are aloof from their current party but carry great weight, like Baroness Fuchs for the Conservatives or Baroness Ann Taylor for Labour, and sometimes even members recently appointed by parties like Lord Edward Fox proved to be quite independent-minded. And since this assembly has no serious political power, it's unclear what caliber of representative will want to step forward. There's no clear path to national or regional government. Caliber is important. Fifthly, control the timetable. I think with an electorally responsive chamber, it's hard to see how timetabling won't become. Members' parties will see advantage to timetabling bills, and that can be introduced fairly easily. Sixthly, there will be no independence from whips in a purely elected chamber. And lastly, the power of delay, as far as I understand the proposals, would be removed. The power of the Lords would be to reject a bill would be removed. And that would be a substantial change from the current proposals, except for with constitutional statutes, which I'll come around to. Now, probably 95 to 100% of legislation in any given session of Parliament would not be impinging on the constitutional statute. So this is not a small change. On this last point, I wanted to raise an issue that the report alludes to, and I want to pick up on. In showdowns between this assembly and the Commons, if the latter, the Commons, prevails regularly and the former is also elected, the question will constantly arise, why should the Commons prevail? The description of elected but ignored doesn't sound very good. I think we need to be careful not to sleepwalk into the process that inadvertently leads to strong bicameralism and then legislative gridlock that will stop elected parties from delivering their manifestos. I'll speak briefly about the function of the proposed chamber and then try to be more constructive with a few suggestions. It seems to me the Assembly has two main but distinct functions. First, to be a venue for the voice of representatives of regions and nations, and second, to be a constitutional safeguard. Now, it seems that these call for different kinds of appointments. The first is essentially a form of descriptive representation, where the candidate in various ways mirrors the characteristics of the electors in the region and nation. The safeguarding role, on the other hand, calls for a certain degree of technical competency, benefits from a degree of experience and expertise to deal with political and legal argument. Now, there is a question, I think, that needs answering about whether regionally based elections will be apt for dealing with questions of straightforwardly national interest. I note here the report doesn't say whether regions will have equal seats regardless of their population size. I'll come back to that. But if we focus on the role of regional electors, of regional representatives in dealing with issues of the national interest, I think we might be setting ourselves up for a certain degree of tension, where there will be representatives who are straightforwardly interested chiefly, if not exclusively, in their own region or their own nation, being asked to provide expert input into national-based legislation. It could encourage a system of law growing that I'd be concerned with. And lastly, with safeguarding, the constitutional safeguarding role, I have no doubt that in removing the appointed peers now, this role will suffer immensely. So let me come around then, by way of conclusion, to some constructive proposals, because I wouldn't be keen to see this proposal be rejected entirely. First of all, I think it would be wise to retain a substantial appointed element of the chamber. This needs considering carefully because the proposal is to have 200 members. If your appointed group is only 15 to 30 appointed peers, I think it wouldn't be able to perform the functions that it has. Secondly, I think for elections, they should be done on a closed list PR basis. So eminent party members can be put forward. They don't have to fight an election under the first past the post system, which would discourage members from doing it. And lastly, Timothy, I think that the chamber should retain the power to reject bills subject to the procedures of the Parliament Act, which allow Congress to prevail. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Gavin.
Great. Well, like Jeff, I also welcome the promise of old House of Lords reform, but I also want to argue that proposals in the report need some revision to bring treatment to the legislative process, treatment of government constitution. The report acknowledges the value of the work of the current laws as much as that of their chairs. The scrutiny of legislation, the work of its committees can be more thorough and effective in the Commons leading to legislative change. And this is largely because of the experience and expertise of their members, particularly the crossbench peers bringing expertise and knowledge that would otherwise be lacking in the Commons sometimes. And the report concludes whatever changes are made should not lose the benefits of this work by the laws. But like Jeff, I worry that the current proposal risks doing precisely that. Now, some will argue that because of this, the government should simply drop the idea of having a democratic House of Lords and concentrate on more modest and achievable things like the appointments process, removing Prime Ministerial patronage, reducing the size of this. Those would have value, but I hope that they will keep alive the promise of democratic. But I think to make this work, it needs to be based on the clear lessons from overseas about what does and doesn't work in terms of second chamber design. Now, our chair, Matthew Palmer, told us in an email that New Zealand abolished its second chamber back in the 1950s because it was, quote, annoying. That's actually quite a common sentiment about second chambers that I think get it wrong. Meg Russell knows how the Canadian Senate has seen its retirement home to engage with politicians and party donors. The Irish Senate tolerated rather than supported by public opinion. The Italian Senate is having little delay, and the Spanish Senate widely derided as a useless body. In contrast, the powerful Australian Senate, populated by a wider array of parties than the Commons, hence not controlled by the government, provides an effective and distinctive process, as does the German Bundesrat. So go for bold reform, but learn what works and what doesn't. Why do I support bold democracy? Well, first, the simple argument the House of Lords does exercise real legislative power, which should flow from a democratic mandate. Secondly, while the Lords can and does improve legislation, I see this happen over and over again, that much of its excellent policy work, including proposed revisions of legislation, currently goes to waste because of its perceived lack of legitimacy. Its amendments can be and often are swatted aside by government and MPs because of the law's unaffected nature. Most of the time it then gives way. So most of the time the law has hamstrung by the widespread lacks in legitimacy. Now, the Brown report proposes to cure this problem and make the new chamber a powerful protector of devolution by making fully elected chambers prepared to represent nations and regions. There's three key problems here, I think, though. To see what we are, we should bring to mind three criteria for a chamber, provided by Meg Russell analysis and accepted by previous parliamentary reports. These are distinct composition, perceived legitimacy, adequate powers. I think if you apply these criteria to the report's proposals, in my view, it passes only the second, perceived legitimacy, which falls down somewhat on the other two. Of these, first, the second chamber must be clearly distinct from the first, both in functions and composition. As I'll explain in a moment, it's doubtful the current proposals would achieve this. On powers, Brown would combine giving a huge boost to the perceived legitimacy of the second chamber with completely removing its current kinds of delay, which are moderate by international standards, over ordinary legislation. Now, the basic principle is generally that powers should follow and match legitimacy. So to hugely increase legitimacy but drastically reduce powers seems perverse. The result of those two problems, that contrary to what the report said it wants, some of the value of the current work of the Lords will be lost. Now let me expand on distinct composition. We know from international experience that where the second chamber is very much like the first, it simply becomes redundant, Italy and Spain. As Waldron argues, why bother with the second chamber if it's controlled by the same body, governing party, as the first chamber? Now, I think from this, some key points follow a couple of already mentioned. First, it's absolutely crucial that it not be controlled by the government. And indeed, all previous reports and proposals from the Wakeman Commission on, agree that no one party should have a majority in the second chamber. And this is very strongly supported. Russell singles out Germany and Australia as having strong, effective second chambers, in part because they have no overall control. To ensure this means the electoral system must be different from the Commons, hence a form of proportional representation is absolutely vital. Third, to help give members of the chamber a distinct character, in part of a more longer-term perspective on public policy and greater independence of mind, members should serve long and non-renewable terms. And fourthly, don't let ministers sit in the chamber. That will dilute both its independence and its distinctiveness. Finally, I join with Jeff in saying that Labour should strongly consider the percentage of members being appointed independent experts. As explained, as well as strongly boosting the distinctiveness of the House, this would also help solve the problem that led the Commission to make its strangest proposal here. And that's the proposal we've already mentioned, to completely remove the powers of the Lords over ordinary legislation. Now, this would partly be balanced by giving special protection over constitutional statutes, and really Haley to comment on that part. I'll just say that in principle, that's perfectly normal. Overseas, second chambers overseas normally have special powers over the Constitution. But I don't think this compensates for removal of the powers for legislation, especially as a report stresses this would apply only a very So this removal of powers, the removal of all powers of delay would also be completely outlined with all the previous reports on the Royal Commission on and all the parliamentary reports and international experience. I can't think of a democratic second chamber overseas that simply has no powers at all over ordinary legislation. And this is for good reason. There's a strong risk that a House with no powers at all will simply be ignored on ordinary legislation. And given how much valuable work the Lords does in improving this now, that I think could be a disaster. But the new chamber must be able to force the government to negotiate over its proposed amendments. And that needs powers. But also this regressive proposal, as I say, to remove those powers is unnecessary. The Court proposes it in order to avoid the new chamber threatening the primacy of the Commons and resulting in legislative gridlock. But these twin bogeymen need to be, which are always trotted out in those proposals, which need to be looked at in light of the international experience. That evidence shows that the problem with gridlock is separated. The Public Administration Committee observed 3/4 of the 64 bicameral legislatures in the world have chambers, and very few suffer from difficulties of gridlock. The US Senate, often mentioned, is actually unusual in having co-equal powers with Congress, and there's no simple mechanism for resolving disputes. It's highly unusual in that. But in any event, there's much better ways of resolving this problem than maintaining overall transparency and gutting the powers of the current House of legislation. Instead, keep the Parliament Acts, retain the Salisbury Convention and suggest including it in the recitals of the legislation establishing the new chamber, and design it so that it can't claim equal difference to the Commons. That, I think, would deal with the issue that led to the proposal to remove its powers of legislation in a better way. So what is that better way? Well, Jeff has mentioned it. Draw on what was the consensus actually amongst all the reports and proposals published on this matter since, and including the Royal Commission, and have a mixed House with something between 60 to 80% of members elected and the rest appointed independent experts across an array of fields. This would solve the threat to Commons primacy. The Commons as a wholly elected body could still claim a stronger democratic mandate. At the same time, the minority of appointed experts could provide the necessary constitutional and special expertise to aid the chamber in its distinctive functions. That would also help supply the desirable independent element and ensure the chamber brings a wide range of views that the Commons does to our uses of the day. It would also help it discharge its intended functions of being a voice for the regions of the UK. If all members are party politicians, and certainly as regards England, I would suspect party control would trump regional representation. All these things would also boost the vital distinctiveness of the second chamber, thus ensuring that the current valuable qualities of the Lords were not lost. And by thus removing the threat to Commons primacy, this would allow the retention of the current House of legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gavin. Haley.
Sure. Thanks. It's an honour to be invited to comment. It's a very interesting time to be having this discussion because it seems like based on the local election results today, we are ripe for a Labour government to be polls or to be believed. I think about 8,000 local authorities across the country today. And it got me to thinking when I opened these proposals, well, what do I fundamentally want? Since we're in the spirit of trying to be helpful here and more useful solutions. And I thought fundamentally, I want an NHS that's fixed. I want a welfare state that cares for myself, any children I'll have, and my aging parents, and an economy in which my gas bill doesn't triple to the profit of fat cat companies, and people live in a society when you have to choose between heating and eating. And the next thing that struck me is that none of these things being fixed, including other things I might worry about, like the ethics of politicians, actually require any meaningful constitutional reform. These could be done by way of simple legislation, better policy, and politicians simply behave better when they are in government. And that made me wonder about a causation argument that underpins this entire report. Is there the necessary causal connection between our collapsing economy and a so-called lack of democracy, that this report seems to put forward. And I have doubts about that. There's certainly a correlation, but I'm not immediately convinced on the text of some 155 pages that there is a causation. The other thing that struck me in some of the more muscular language that this report uses, that Timothy has also picked up on, is the idea that there's something paradoxical about the present role of the House of Lords. And I would support moderate reform. I would support the retention of the appointed House of Lords for many of the reasons that Jeff has pointed out, this really important expertise. But I query whether or not there's a paradox in the so-called undemocratic institution protecting and facilitating a representative democratic institution. And I think that misunderstands something about the separation. It misunderstands something about the internal separation of powers in Parliament. And I know we have two extremely, possibly even more extremely eminent judges sitting here. It misunderstands how undemocratic institutions structurally protect the democratic elements of the Constitution, since no one's done it yet, and it must be done at every British constitutional event. The cases I'm referring to are, of course, the decisions of the UK Supreme Court in Miller No. 1 and Miller No. 2, where an undemocratic institution of experts stepped in to use a particular mode of legal reasoning in order to facilitate the central of Parliament in the British Constitution. The other notable civil absence in this report is any reference to control of the rampant accretion of executive power, particularly by way of delegated legislation and the removal of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act that we've seen since 2010. On more specific detail, I would agree with Professor Gavin Phillipson that the removal of the power of delay from the House of Lords, especially if it's supposed to be more legitimate, although I question whether democracy is the only legitimacy game in our constitutional time. For example, Meg Russell has done extensive work building on the work of European Union scholars to show that there are various values of legitimacy that the House of Lords, our courts, and various other institutions instantiate in the Constitution that help bolster and facilitate the proper place for democracy. And this report seems to be concerning in its perhaps conscious choice, perhaps the result of a compromise, to not deal with or engage particularly well with these alternative arguments about legitimacy. I want to move on to the specific role of constitutional statutes, because that's what I promised the rest of the panel I'd do. So, as Gavin has pointed out, it's not unusual for a second chamber to have budgetary responsibility, but to have significant constitutional responsibility. The report suggests that there will be a core of constitutional statutes that will be considered unamendable or within the power or purview, if I understand it correctly, of the second chamber to prevent wrecking amendments, unless presumably they get consensus of the elected houses, although that's not spelled out explicitly. The idea of a constitutional statute is not a present parliamentary doctrine, as many of you will be familiar with. It's a doctrine of the common law. Even as I say that, I question whether or not it's actually a doctrine. Okay? It's definitely an idea of the common law, and that idea was thought up, presumably of an afternoon, by Lord Justice Laws when he was dealing with a particularly difficult judicial review case concerning the Weights and Measures Act and the European Communities Act 1972, and their apparent clash relative to the statutory interpretation doctrine of implied repeal. And this is no disrespect to the late Lord Justice Laws, but he had to come up with a definition of constitutional statutes on the fly. And to be fair to him, he did better than probably most anyone would ever in the circumstances that he faced. He said a constitutional statute is one which conditions the legal relationship between the citizen and the state in some general overarching manner, or a constitutional statute is one which enlarges or diminishes the scope of what we would now regard as fundamental constitutional rights. And we can instinctively realise that that definition is at once over-inclusive and under-inclusive. The Labour Party document does come up with some central cases of what it considers constitutional statutes to be: the Devolution Acts, the Constitutional Reform Act, the Including in the title, and the Parliament Acts, and the Acts of Union and Settlement. What's conspicuous by its absence is the Human Rights Act 8. And perhaps for the traditional or core Labour voter, the Health and Social Care Act 2012, which removed the obligation on the government to provide healthcare for the citizen, you would think would be a constitutional statute that changed the relationship between citizen and state in some fundamental overarching manner that would be ripe for repeal, along with some other possibly central cases enacted in the last 12 to 18 months: the Judicial Review of Courts Act, reducing judicial review of the Upper Tribunal, the Elections Act, tinkering with the independence of the Electoral Commission and requiring voter ID, and the Dissolution and Calling Parliament Act, reanimating the prerogative power if such a thing is possible, and excluding all forms of judicial review by the courts. The other thing that worries me greatly, and I will say this presumably by way of conclusion, is the position that the proposals proposed to put the UK Supreme Court in as mediator between two democratically elected houses in the event of a predicted clash on an as yet uncrystallised list of constitutional statutes. Not only do we not have a definition of constitutional statutes, and notably not even any of the courts that apply this doctrine generally endorse the definition of justice laws for good reason, as it's fraught subject. These statutes are not born, they're made, they're designated. It's not a question of natural science. But the proposals in the report suggest that there is power of the upper house to prevent a wrecking amendment to a constitutional statute that's protected. And where there's a dispute between the two houses, this can be made a reference to the UK Supreme Court, and the UK Supreme Court will apply the logic and language of devolution adjudication to decide whether or not the amendment posed by the Commons to a constitutional statute that the upper house disagrees with relates to and has a more than close or consequential connection to the constitutional statute question. That is not a straightforward question of statutory construction per se. There are always ideas about normative choice that go into these questions, and as we can see from some of the more recent devolution litigation, this leaves the court in a very vexed position. It would risk politicising the UK Supreme Court in a way that's potentially damaging for that institution. So I confess to being deeply sceptical about the foreign proposal on all these bases. And I also think we would need to have a serious think about the Salisbury-Adamson Convention, whether or not we want it to survive. And I think that seems to be a more keeping it in point of house, keeping that convention, and keeping the powers of delay seems to be a much better way of instantiating constitutional balance and more democracy for democracy's sake. And to sum up, I think the proposals about constitutional statutes raise more questions than the answer. Who is to decide what's constitutional in this new Britain? And potentially drag the court even closer to questions of politics than it would already be as a result of successive options. Thank you.
Thank you, Hayley. Michaela.
Thanks a lot to Arun and Kate O'Regan for inviting me to speak here as an outsider. I've taken this opportunity to try and educate myself a little bit more about British public law, and I've greatly enjoyed it. It's one of those systems where, you know, I feel coming from a German perspective, there's certain natural countries you look at, and Britain is not one of them, just because it's so difficult and weird. So this has been an education. I was afraid of my comments overlapping too much with everyone, but they're not actually, and I think that's possibly a good thing. So the spirit in which I've been reading this report was sort of from what seemed to me the key concerns of the report, and I think Jim Gallagher this morning stressed that, which is a concern with, you know, creating a more federal system, giving more power to specific regions, more powers to the local government. And so I've been sort of asking myself, in the spirit of that, if that's what you want to do, how well is the report doing that job, and how good are the propositions? So I have some general remarks, and then I'll say something about the second chamber. The general remarks are that it seems that federalism is, of course, an issue that can be addressed from a lot of different perspectives. You may have federalism from what's being called an identity perspective, right? Diverse populations. And there seems to be an argument about that for Scotland because of Wales, different local communities, and therefore you want to have federalism. A different argument for federalism is a much broader sort of accountability enhancing. We want to take governmental decisions at a lower level that may have to do something with the person, but it doesn't necessarily have to be conditional. And so one of the things that was striking me when I was reading this is it's often, sorry, should I be putting that out? It's often not entirely clear what the report is wanting to do in that regard. And in general, I was thinking there was a bit of a sort of tension between political symbolism and what was actually proposed in terms of real powers. And here, I think, and that's my disagreement, I think, with the other panelists. In some ways, if you want to create a truly federal system, it's not too radical, but it's not radical enough. So let me explain that. There is some mention of, for example, principles such as subsidiarity and solidarity. Now, perhaps I'm traipsing into the classical lawyer's fallacy of focusing on what is justiciable and what courts can do with something. But we've seen, like from the European Union, I think we've seen from German federalism, and I would actually add the US, that those kinds of clauses, you know, powers should be exercised at a lower level, unless it's better if they exercise at a higher level because that's more efficient. That those kinds of clauses are creating a lot of strife and conflict and are very hard to sort of actually handle in a party political system where naturally there will be different opinions about what this means in concrete cases. And the second one, the second comment I want to make is on the second chamber. And here I note that the second chamber is supposed to be called Assembly of Nations and Regions. So reading from there on the functions that the second chamber has, it seemed to me a little bit of false advertising, to be honest, because there is a sense that the second chamber should be doing a lot of things. And this is actually what I think connects to what all of you have been saying and Tarun and others have been writing. My sense is that a lot of people in the room want the second chambers to basically be doing a little bit what the Lords are doing, but doing it a bit better and with better democratic legitimacy, that maybe they can be less easily dismissed. Now, I would say that's a sort of second chamber that has a mainly deliberative function. And if that's what you want, then all of the proposals you've been making sound very sensible. But reading the report, I'm not entirely sure that that's sort of actually what's mainly intended. And I think the report is unclear about that, partly. Because if the chamber is sort of true to the name and should be primarily a federal chamber that is safeguarding sort of regional interests, then the functions, and that goes back to, I think, what Sylvia has been saying, the functions should be fitting that form, and it should be fitting the electoral composition. So one of the standard problems I think we have from a comparative perspective of second chambers, and Jeff has been talking about that, is always the question, is it party politics that are dominating, or is it some kind of other interests that are dominating? And one of the ways in which we can sort of make sure that it's not just party politics is sometimes by giving these second chambers more specific functions. That's certainly, I think, how it works in the German Bundesrat, which has some powers to reject certain laws, but only specific laws and with regard to specific competences and laws where the interests of the federal state are particularly involved. So not every law actually goes to the Bundesrat, but only some select ones. And actually that we have been going through a number of federalism reforms. It's not that the German system has been working wonderfully actually over the years. We've had several reforms in that regard. And those reforms have been basically making less laws, changing the constitution in a way that less laws need consent of the Bundesrat, but some do. And that is essential. And if you look now at the sort of academic literature, talking about whether the Bundesrat is doing its job well, then you see that the argument is generally, yes, there are some party politics. You can't really get rid of that entirely, but there's also a fair amount of a sense that actually in some sense the different states work together because there are actually interests of the regions where all the regions have particular interests, for example, not to be burdened with certain expenses because the federal government wants to pass a law which actually puts the states all in a difficult position and similar things like that. So I think I will keep it at that. There is a sense now that the current proposal is what Germans would call an eierlegende Wollmilchsau, and it's just such a nice word. It means basically a farm animal that can lay eggs, that has wool you can use, that provides milk, and you can eat the bacon. So there is a lot in that proposal that is sort of admirable, but I'm not sure that the second chamber can really fulfill all of those functions. And the first thing I think to me would be to think about which of these functions are really key. Should it be a deliberative function mainly, or should it be really representing federal interests? And I'll stop there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Michaela. And now our discussant, Matthew.
Inga mana, inga iwi, inga reo, tēnā koutou katoa. I greet you in Te Reo Māori, the language of the Indigenous people of New Zealand. I do this partly to encourage you to perk up in our post-lunch session. I also do it partly to emphasize the qualifications which must be attached to my comments as a New Zealander, and even more so as a New Zealand judge. I have no mandate or jurisdiction to advocate or make any normative arguments about constitutional reform in New Zealand, let alone in the United Kingdom. In the words of one of your best known politicians, I couldn't possibly comment. But perhaps as a former public servant and an academic who has studied and written on comparative constitutional design, I might be able to make some observations about my own context and perspective, which may at the margins be helpful to your current debates about the electoral system and second house. I propose to make 3 initial points which reflect New Zealand's lack of a second chamber, our experience of electoral reform, and the importance of constitutional culture. These serve both as context for understanding my remarks, as well as for whatever lessons you may think of, may think might very well apply in the United Kingdom. And then I'll make observations about one salient point made by each of my colleague panelists. First, in relation to New Zealand and a second house, we do not have one. We used to have one. We had one for almost 100 years, from the time of self-government in 1853. It was called the Legislative Council. It was appointed by the executive for life initially, and then after 1891 for 7-year terms. There were initially required to be at least 10 members of the council, though it got up to 53 at various points. And in 1950, it was abolished and not replaced. As Gavin said, my overall characterization of the reason for abolition is that it was annoying. It was unrepresentative. It had no democratic legitimacy. It amended only 9.4% of the bills that went to it after 1936. It got in the way of reform initiatives of successive elected governments, and there were ongoing criticisms of appointment to it by one government or another in terms of political patronage, stacking, swamping, which are explicable in probably simple game theory terms, as well as even simpler political terms. I'm sure all of those features are entirely unique to New Zealand. In New Zealand, they led one historian who's now at Oxford to characterize the council from the late 1890s as effectively castrated. Replacement of our second house was continually mooted. It was even the subject of an Act of Parliament, which was passed with the help of additional appointment of members to that house in 1914, but never brought into effect because the government got cold feet. In 1950, it was simply abolished by Act of Parliament after the appointment of sufficient, double the number of members that were required to effect that purpose. They were known as the Suicide Squad. And that was that. Never seemed to make much difference. contrary to the words which that very famous New Zealander, Bilbo Baggins, almost said in the movie, so I paraphrase, we lost our house and we do not want help to take it back. So in 1993, a referendum was held in New Zealand about whether to adopt proportional representation. And the government initially proposed that if proportional representation was not accepted by referendum, the voters would vote on whether to have a second house. There was so much opposition to that prospect that it was completely dropped from the bill. My second point is about the electoral system. There is no doubt that the move to the MMP electoral system of proportional representation along German lines has had a thoroughgoing systemic effect on governance and its nature in New Zealand. Parliament is more representative. Māori are 20% of the House and 25% of Cabinet at the moment, as against 17% of the population. Women are now 50% of the House and the Cabinet. And most importantly, MMP has subjected the monopoly of coercive power wielded by the executive with a majority in the House to the discipline of coalition formation and negotiation by governments of all persuasions. Changing the electoral system so as to impact on central political dynamics, determining legislation, including budgets, does make a difference. My third general point is about constitutional culture. Every nation has its own distinctive culture. I suggest and have suggested that every nation has its own distinctive constitutional culture. I've recently identified New Zealand's constitutional culture as manifesting egalitarianism, faith in authority, fairness, and pragmatism. I would not dare to characterize the UK's culture. I certainly will not speculate on whether UK constitutional culture is marked most particularly by tradition, centralisation, imperialism, and incrementalism. Wouldn't dare to speculate about that. But whatever it is, I do suggest that if proposed constitutional change is to stick, is to take to the body politic, then it would be helpful for it to run with the grain rather than against the grain of constitutional culture. So with those 3 points of mind, I make one point about each of my fellow discussants' contributions. Michaela emphasises the difficult and weird nature of the UK Constitution, which strikes me as a fair comment. She disagreed, thankfully, with other panel members in suggesting that subsidiarity clauses are difficult to enforce in concrete cases through the courts. I would suggest that that is a point worth considering and paying more attention to. It is difficult for courts in a Westminster system to police political legislatures through conventional judicial techniques. It might be more effective to do so through procedural mechanisms. Hayley Hooper's point that I wanted to pause on is that none of the things that she wants fixed would be addressed by constitutional reform necessarily. This is a serious question which proponents of constitutional reform always face and should face, because the burden of persuasion is on those who want change. I have to say I was entirely persuaded and accept her submission that apparently undemocratic institutions, maybe like the judiciary, can facilitate democracy. But I do suggest that if you really want to change the system, you want something thoroughgoing. In New Zealand, that was proportional representation. Jeff draws on his experience of advising a House of Lords committee, and as I understand it, argues there is value in what would be lost in terms of technical lawmaking capability. I understand him to be suggesting that and in offering options for ensuring that those virtues that are currently existing in the House of Lords are retained. I should note that one of the ongoing criticisms of the New Zealand single small House of Representatives has been the impediments in it under governments of all persuasions to prioritising technical law reform measures and concentrating on the details of lawmaking. This is an important point and needs to be taken into account carefully in any proposed reform, as long as it does not undermine the overall exercise, which I take to be the revival of legitimacy in an important branch of government. Gavin also comments on the importance of technical expertise, but what struck me most about what he said was about Meg Russell's criterion of distinct composition of the second house. The Commission's emphasis on composition by representatives of nations and regions is an answer to that. It clearly needs to be fleshed out substantially, but I wasn't entirely confident from Gavin's contribution that such composition can necessarily be counted on to be clearly favoured popularly. Maybe you will tell me I'm wrong, but if I'm right and representation of the different nations or regions of the country is not a particularly salient fault line in this country, then from a simple New Zealand perspective, it might be thought that if the UK doesn't quite know what its distinct composition of its second house should be, then there is a real question as to whether there should be one at all. On that note, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for that perspective. We will stop sharp at 2:30 for tea, but that thanks to the every panelist being so efficient. And
is this on? Good. Well, welcome back, everybody. Your stamina is commendable, but I actually think that you're very wise still to be with us, because the proposals that we're going to discuss in this panel for what I would call strengthening mostly existing mechanisms for keeping people in order and maintaining constitutional standards, mainly in the executive. So that is what we're about. And my personal and probably wrong view is that this could actually be done. It would not take a revolution or even a constitutional moment for it to happen. It just needs the will to do it and sensible proposals. The report is not very detailed on its proposals, but it does have proposals for making the most of the constitutional guardians. I like the word constitutional guardians. So that's the approved Institute for Government term, is it not? Yes, well, I am one of the constitutional practitioners that have been attempting to advise the Institute for Government on their body. So that's what we're calling them. And we too think that they're a very important feature of the Constitution, which when I was teaching constitutional administrative law in the University of Manchester from 1967 till 1984, we'd never heard of them. A lot of them didn't exist then, but nevertheless, it just shows how necessary and important they are. So without more ado, let us introduce the panel. So we have Jake Rowbottom, who is a professor of law in the University of Oxford, specialist in constitutional administration and media law. And that fits in very well because you're really interested in freedom of speech. And of course, freedom of speech as a constitutional important freedom. I think we all understand that that fits, doesn't it? And then we have Aileen Kavanagh, and you're a professor of constitutional governance. Correct, yes, in Trinity College, Dublin. Splendid, I was there only recently, enjoyed myself. Yeah. And you have written a book called The Collaborative Constitution. So you can see where she's coming from. Yeah. And then Murray Hunt, who is director of the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law. But you were also for a very long time the legal advisor to the Joint Committee on Human Rights, as promised, were you not? And you're also the UK's alternate member of the Venice Commission for Democracy through Law. So fully into that area of the establishment, that despite having been a barrister and helped to set up matrix chambers. So pretty well known. Now, Marcel, you're Chief Executive of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And you're basically a civil servant by career who's headed up a number of regulatory bodies of one sort or another. So I see you as the doer person on the panel. Right. And Pamela is going to be our discussant. And Pamela is a New Zealander who has spent her professional life in Australia, principally or possibly even exclusively in the state of Victoria, where I first met her when she was a judge on the Court of Appeals. But before that, you were Solicitor General in Victoria, weren't you? And played a very large part in the adoption of the Victorian Charter of Rights and Responsibilities. So again, and since you retired from the bench, rather like me, you've engaged in a lot of academic and public service type roles. So welcome to everybody on the panel. And I've suggested that they go in the order that they are on your programme, which means that Jake draws the first short straw and goes first.
Okay, great. Well, thanks a lot for the introduction there. It's nice to kick things off. To start off with, I'm going to talk a little bit about cleaning up politics and political ethics, and then I'll say a few words about the kind of guarantor institutions. So I'm going to make 2 points, really. First is, I'm going to connect to this idea that cleaning up politics isn't simply about dealing with bad behaviour from politicians. I'm going to argue, first of all, that cleaning up politics is about the distribution of political power, and it's about who are politicians responsive to. And then the second point I'm going to look at is the role of guarantor institutions, or whatever we want to call them, basically stopping government from fixing the rules in their own favour for their own partisan advantage. So those are the 2 main themes that I'm going to look at. So let's start with thinking about cleaning up politics, or I think in the report it says cleaning up Westminster. You look at it, there's a number of proposals out there. It all feels to me a little bit piecemeal, right? You've got get rid of foreign money to political parties, no second jobs for MPs, get a corruption commissioner, have independent oversight of the ministerial code, and so on. All of these at face value to me sound pretty sensible. I think much will depend on how they're executed, and it'll be in the detail. But I'm a little bit more pessimistic than Lady Hale, I'm afraid, in that I kind of feel like these proposals, one way or another, some of them will hit the buffers, they'll get watered down, there'll be some problems, some of them will get derailed, some of them will be implemented. I think rather than thinking about the detail of these proposals, I want to think, well, what's the overarching goal? So if any of these policies get dropped, we can say, well, what were we trying to pursue? How else can we get there? And part of the report, certainly the earlier parts of the Brown Commission's report, refers to trust. And we heard about this morning, a lack of trust in politics. Now, I don't think some of the proposals are really going to address that. Because if we think, say, for example, pointing at corruption, well, first of all, we don't know how to address it or whether we should address it, because we don't know whether the trust is actually mistrust is justified or misplaced. We don't know what the cause of the mistrust is. It's quite hard to find a solution. If we appoint a corruption commissioner, we have a corruption commissioner, that's a statement of mistrust. We're saying we're going to watch over you because we think you're going to behave badly. So I'm not sure that really sends out a signal of restoring trust in politics. And even if you did have such a person and they're investigating allegations of corruption, that's never reassuring to the public. If you're hearing about a politician who's being investigated, you don't think, oh, well, that's a good thing. That reassures me. It tends to ring alarm bells. So much for restoring trust. What about an argument then in justification of saying, well, it's to deal with corruption? I think this comes across in the report where it's about corruption in a narrow sense, dealing with bad behaviour from the politicians. Now, I think that's important. That's obviously an important issue. But I think the problem with cleaning up politics is dealing with a much broader question, and it's about the distribution of political power. And I think by taking that step, you can connect it with some of the other themes that are within the report. So what I mean by this is that, let's say we're looking at political finance and political donations. The problem isn't really, or isn't just, that a political donation might secure a favour or a benefit or convince a politician. It's the fact that those people with a lot of money are in the position to decide which parties are going to be best placed to contest the next election. So people are making those decisions about the political system based on their own money. Similarly, with lobbying, it's not that you've secured a favour or secured some change in government policy. I think the problem is that if you've got the money to get a lobbyist or get access to those companies, then you've got a seat at the table. You are getting a hearing that you wouldn't otherwise get, regardless of whether you actually convince the minister. Similarly, the problem with second jobs. It's not with MPs getting second jobs. The problem isn't simply that they're making money on the taxpayer's time. It's that the company that employs the MP is getting a person on the inside of government and they get access. And it might skew the perspective of the MP as well. So they're sympathetic to the interests of their employer. So for that reason, I think really the idea that I'm getting at is that the problem with seeing in Westminster isn't just about behaviour, it's also about the distribution of political power. It's about who gets to influence political decision making. I think that ties in with the broader theme of equality. So what should be done then? I don't think the solution is simply to have a commissioner or corruption commissioner who's going to crack down on bad behaviour. I think there's difficulties in doing that as well. There's always problems of proof and evidence. So I think what you want to think about is, can you have systems in place that reduce the incentives on politicians to respond to those with more money or to donors and so on, rather than trying to regulate their individual behaviour and individual decisions. So rather than sort of trying to have a corruption commissioner who's going to look at whether there was influence or not, would it be better to reform the system of party funding, for example? Obviously, that raises a number of difficult questions, but that might at least deal with the problem of incentives. Okay. Now, with this, what would be the role then of an integrity or guarantor institution? What would they be able to do? And that comes to the second thing. Well, in my view, it's not just about enforcing the rules and investigating misconduct. I think the guarantor institutions have a role at a much earlier stage in the process in actually devising the rules and then determining what the systems are going to be. So I think a guarantor institution is not simply a watchdog or an enforcer. And so I think it should have some role in being consulted and actually devising the systems that constrain politicians. Because here, if government has the control over the rules and the systems of ethics, then we run into the problem of other types of corruption. And the type of corruption here would be changing the rules that regulate politicians for their own partisan advantage. So it's saying, passing a law saying, we're going to clean up politics, we're going to sort out money in politics, but really what you do is you enact a measure that's going to hobble your political opponents and make the political system less competitive. So I think the way that could tie in is the idea that the guarantor institutions have a role in devising these rules, consulting, making sure they're not for partisan advantage, and that fits in with the broader theme within the Brown Report about decentralising power. Because I think part of the problem, which we heard about this morning, is this idea that government's got central control over all of the rules. So how would the courts relate to that? What would the role of the courts be? I haven't really thought about it too much, but I think there are certain things that could be done. So if government passed a law and didn't go through that process of consultation or didn't follow the advice of a guarantor institution, then I think the proposal of law might be more vulnerable to legal challenge, whether that's in judicial review or under the Human Rights Act. Similarly, if a guarantor institution makes a recommendation that the system of political ethics needs to be reformed in a particular way, and the minister doesn't act on it, then you might say that should be more open to judicial review as well. You might have that kind of system of review that support the recommendations of the guarantor institution. What I've suggested happens to some extent anyway, but it happens informally and it's often subject to political pressure. So, we see that through threats to cut the funding of the guarantor institution, threats to abolish the body, there's those kind of maybe giving them flack and criticism. So you often get those attempts to influence. So I think the big challenge that we have in an unwritten constitution is how do we ensure that they've got a degree of stability in organisation, funding and appointments that means that they're less vulnerable to that political pressure. And how do we have that form of, it's not political entrenchment, but some kind of heightened political protection. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is my microphone working?
Try unmuting it, like just like
Good.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here at the Bonavero Institute, as always, where I've had so many experiences of robust and respectful and really stimulating reflection and debate. So it's wonderful to be here. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks to Karen Kaitan for inviting me onto this wonderful panel to talk about the separation of powers and for your openness to different perspectives on this. So in the way the panel was framed was ethics, political ethics and integrity, and fourth branch guarantor institutions. And one of the questions that arose in the framing was, what sort of relationship do these fourth branch guarantor institutions have with the executive, the legislature, and the courts? And so in a way, I want to just put a few tentative reflections into the discussion, but push back a little bit on this framing, which doesn't settle very well with me. Now, the idea of the fourth branch or a new fourth branch of government stems from US scholarship, the work of Mark Tushnet and Bruce Ackerman and so on, who posited that this disparate array of institutions should be identified as a fourth branch of government. So what institutions are we talking about? Well, read this list. I mean, we're looking at integrity and ethics commissions, anti-corruption commissions, equality and human rights commissions, boundary commissions, audit commissions. We're also talking about parliamentary standards authorities, ombudspersons. The media, I think, should be in there. And in some of the writing on fourth branch institutions, the courts are included as a fourth branch, as part of the fourth branch of government, because the idea underpinning the nomenclature is that, if you like, what I would call the primary branches of government, the courts, the executive, and the legislature, are not or cannot do the job correctly. They cannot provide the goods. We need a fourth branch to come in to guarantee that they will do so. So just working from first principles, just some very simple reflections. Are these institutions a fourth branch? To my mind, they are too disparate to be identified as one single fourth branch, separate from, sitting apart from the other branches. Some of these institutions are other branches. They may be the courts, for example, which I would think of as the third branch of government. Some are within the executive or within the legislature. And here I'm thinking of, the Civil Service, the Joint Committee on Human Rights, the Parliamentary Standards Authority, and various other bodies that we're talking about specifically in this report, which are within the executive. Some are NGOs. They are specifically not branches of government. They are non-governmental organizations. And some are, and this is now an old-fashioned word, quangos, quasi-autonomous NGOs. They're hybrid organizations with a partial public authority feature. So can we or should we bunch these together and think of them as one branch meaningfully? It seems to me that I see them as being disparate institutions located in different parts of the constitutional system, both within, between, beyond the three branches of government. So another feature to highlight, and I think this was mentioned by Lady Hale at the beginning when she referred to the executive, and it's something that we as lawyers maybe sometimes forget, is that these integrity institutions that are set up to monitor the government must be set up by the government. They must be funded by the government.
For them to have any meaningful role, there must be buy-in from the government. The government must give them the information on which they scrutinize the government. That is to highlight the relationship that occurs there between the person who is monitored, or the body who is monitored, and the body that is doing the monitoring. And I think it's important in understanding these institutions, and here is where, forgive me, the collaborative constitution comes in. There is a very important relational dimension to understanding how these institutions work. So I don't really see it as a separate branch of government, and not the fourth or the fifth or the sixth branch. I also think that acknowledging the role of the executive highlights the plurality of the executive in any system, or particularly Westminster systems. In other words, that within the executive branch, we have the core political executive, and then we have many other bodies at arm's length at various degrees from that political executive. And here we have the advisory, critical, and fundamental integrity function of the civil service, which Hannah White has written so informatively about in recent times. So those are my concerns. So how should we think of them? Well, you know, I fear that I come over old school on this, but I see them as accountability actors, a myriad disparate set of accountability actors who are located, as I say, within, across, between, outside, and with the three main branches of government, and their role is to hold government actors to account. Simply viewing them as accountability actors means that we're not focused so much on the separateness and distance. We're focused on their function. It also highlights the complexity of accountability in the modern state. The existence of this disparate array of institutions, some of which are old, some of which are new, and there tends to be a proliferation of them, of course, in contemporary time. It doesn't refute traditional understandings of the separation of powers, but it warns us to add more granularity to the picture. If we want to understand how government ministers are held to account, we need to dig deep into the branches, particularly, I would say, the executive and legislative branch, and we need to explore this thick ecosystem of accountability actors that surround the government. So accountability actors, other ways of describing them would be to use the word constitutional watchdog. I think that has been used in the Great Constitution Unit report on constitutional watchdog, and also constitutional guarantees. Or guardians. Yes, let me talk about guardians a bit later, but just for a moment focus on watchdog. I think this is helpful because it's informative and accurate. It emphasizes that their role is to watch, to oversee, to monitor, to check, to sit on these government actors' shoulders and look at what they do and pull them up if they're not doing it well. Now, watchdogs can bark, and watchdogs can sometimes bite, but barking or biting doesn't put food on the table. There is no way that these accountability actors can do the job of government. We need actually elected, we're in a democracy, we need elected actors in Parliament to do the job of regulating social security, ensuring that there's employment, and ensuring that there is food on our shelves. No accountability actor can substitute for the primary roles, which are the executive, the legislature, and the courts have a different role as well. So I'm in favor of thinking of them as watchdogs, as accountability actors. What about the option that Lady Hale suggested, guardians, and how is that different from guarantors? I think a guardian is similar to a watchdog, and it also emphasizes accountability. And to be a guardian is to protect something. And of course, these bodies may have a role in protecting something, but can they guarantee it? I would say no. Now, it is true that no branch of government can guarantee any of the other democratic values protection. No branch of government and no system can guarantee these things. To my mind, there is no guarantee in any democratic system or any political system, full stop. But by the same token, these accountability actors, these checkers, these monitors, can't guarantee it either. They might help, but they might also hinder for the reasons that Jake gave. They might undermine trust. Using terminology that has unequivocal positive valence lures us into thinking that once we put one of these institutions in place, problem solved, fourth branch to the rescue. These accountability actors can cause problems, as is shown in the NHS and in the schooling system here in the UK, where there was an increase in the accountability culture, which actually, in some cases, prevented teachers and nurses and doctors from doing the job they were doing and spending half their time accounting for what they were doing, etc. So it can undermine morale. It certainly doesn't necessarily breed trust. Okay, just a few concluding comments.
Just a few.
Okay, just one then. I think going back to the wording of the South African Constitution, which is so beautifully written, it says that the role of these institutions is to support democracy, institutions supporting democracy. I think this is also insightful in terms of understanding their role. How can they support democracy if they're checking, if they're saying no, if they're holding them to account, if they're pointing out flaws? Well, for the reasons that Hayley gave in the previous panel, you need checks and you need democratic discipline, what I call disciplined democracy, mediated majoritarianism, in order to have a fully functioning and flourishing democratic system. So I end on a note of saying that I totally endorse the potential value of these institutions. I think they are part and parcel of a functioning democracy. But I would be careful about looking at them and thinking, can they help? But might they hinder? So to look at it in a balanced way, evaluating the pros and cons. And in that way of looking at things, we are not presuming that they are our saviors, but simply safeguards. So,
thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Mo.
Thank you very much indeed, Brenda. So I share Aileen's discomfort about the terminology here, guarantor institutions, fourth branch. The problem is if you try to draw up a list of these, it's absolutely vast. And so, but I was part of the sort of conventional and focus on one aspect which they all share, and that is the need for independence. Because I think that all these institutions that we're talking about here are bodies which have a recognised constitutional function, which need to be independent from the government, crucially. And I think that's the crucial feature of it, which I really want to focus on. I think that's what unites these we're talking about. A particular species of these institutions, that is part of the human rights machinery, which I meant to define very broadly. Because I think those bodies or institutions, offices, actually have some quite useful lessons for in relation to independence. And there's also quite a rich body of standards and independence needs for those particular types of institutions, particularly international standards. So I'm going to talk talking about human rights machinery. Now, on Wednesday next week, what Aileen likes to call the illegal migration bill is going to be starting its passage through the House of Lords. It's a quite extraordinary piece of legislation. I'm sure you're all. During my time at the JCHR, which was 13 years in total, I can't recall a single piece of legislation which has so many human rights and accessibility problems on the face of the bill. It raises serious accessibility issues with the Refugee Convention, with the ECHR, with the European Convention Against Trafficking, and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. A number of very serious compatibility issues raised on the face of the bill. So it's a simple bill which really requires extensive detailed scrutiny in Parliament, And Parliament needs all the help it can get from the expert bodies who know about those human rights treaties to assist it in this function of approving that bill. And in this case, of course, given the subject matter, those the most important ones are the EHRC, the Children's Commissioner, and the Anti-Slavery Commissioner. So the EHRC and the Children's Commissioner have both published briefings about the bill. Interestingly, this is an aside. It's quite interesting if you look at the form of those briefings. They're briefings which, on the face of it, look very much like briefings from other NGOs or society organizations. I think that speaks to something about state and institution in our current constitutional culture, that they look like that rather than advice to governments on something on which these bodies are recognized. But what about the Anti-Slavery Commissioner? Well, as you probably are all well aware, we really don't have one. It was occupied until April last year by a very effective Anti-Slavery Commissioner, Sarah Thornton, who stepped down in April. And the post has not yet been filled. And that means that this bill is going to go through Parliament without the benefits of that particular constitutional watchdog, whatever you want to call the nature of the office, but a very important role, scrutinising it, challenging the government in relation to it. And one can't help but suspect that it's not a legislative activity and a fairly bill to post it itself. So why am I talking about the bill next week and next week about our constitutional watchdogs? My general point is that while superficially we have here in the UK some pretty well developed human rights machinery, some pretty good institutions, some pretty good offices, and we've had a number of individuals who have fulfilled those offices very ably, in practice they're very vulnerable to a determined government that doesn't want to listen to them, doesn't want them to answer their accountability assertions. And that's because they don't have the necessary institutional guarantees of the independence that they need, underpinning them in a legal form. Now, the JCHR has always taken a strong interest in human rights machinery, and in a series of reports on all of these institutions, DHRC, Children's Commissioner, Anti-Slavery Commissioner, Review of Terrorism and State and others, it has spelled out in scrutinising the legal framework of these different bodies what the requirements of independence mean for that particular body. And independence is one of the most crucial aspects of these bodies, so it's been very much a focus of the JCHR. I just wanted to spend a moment telling you what the committee said about the Anti-Slavery Commissioner when it was being established in the Modern Slavery Act in 2015. The committee identified quite a number of serious shortcomings in the legislative framework which established the Anti-Slavery Commission. To give you a sample of some of them, appointments, obviously hugely important related to independence, left entirely to the discretion of the Home Secretary. No requirements at all in the legislation that you quantify an independent public appointments commission or private commission in the Brown reports. Tenure, there's absolutely no provision in the Act about the duration of the appointments, whether the term is renewable, the grounds on which the person can be removed, the process to remove big silence. Power of initiative. The Commissioner doesn't actually have a power of initiative. They may only report on a permitted matter on by the Secretary of State. Their strategy requires approval by the Secretary of State. Their reports are laid before Parliament by the Secretary of State and can be redacted on certain grounds by the Secretary of State. And not surprisingly, the JCHR concluded that the Commissioner cannot be described as independent in any meaningful sense. Quite a strong conclusion, but I think one warranted by careful looking at the statutory framework. Now, the government's response was a single amendment to the bill. It didn't address any of those substantive points that the committee had raised. What it did was it inserted the word independence into the title of the document. So this is one of those fantastic moments when working in Parliament. You can imagine the conversation in this office. The committee is saying independent. I know it's called the independence. So the JCHR, not surprisingly, in its report on our amendments, commented the post cannot be made genuine independence merely by adding a label. Now, fast forward, in May 2018, the first of the Anti-Slavery Commission designed following a number of public disagreements with the government. This was Kevin Highland. And in his resignation letter, he pointed out that independence of the Commissioner is vital for success of the role. But, he said, at times, independence is felt somewhat discretionary from the Home Office rather than legally bestowed. So that was one of those told you so moments for the JCH. Usually doesn't issue told you so reports. But this was something which could really have been foretold by anybody looking carefully at the legal framework in the Act of 2015. Now, the second commissioner, Sarah Thornton, again, a very independent-minded person, former chief constable. When she sat down after 3 years last April, she said that she did not feel, unlike her predecessor, there had been interference in the role. So it may be that there's been some learning that she may be more robust, you know, but if you look at what's happened since then, it raises a separate set of concerns about the independence of the commission. Open recruitment process was conducted, interviews were held, and before Sarah Thornton left her office, no appointment has been made, no appointment has been announced. Only a further this that the preferred candidate secretary. And that remains the case more than a year after the commissioner last was in office. There is no watchdog at this really crucial time in relation to modern slavery and this legislation is before the House. And Karen Bradley, the former Conservative Minister for Modern Slavery and now chair of the Joint Trafficking in Modern Slavery, she said in an article in House magazine, legislation which will impact victims of modern slavery should not be created in the absence of independent slavery. Very strong statement. You have to have these watchdogs in place if you're going to bring this sort of legislation before the House. And Alistair Carmichael, in the meantime, has also introduced a private members' bill, which would enable Parliament itself to make an appointment which would be left unfilled for 3 months. Quite an interesting idea of Parliament being the appointing body, at least in the default way, private government to govern it. And this is the general problem. This isn't just a problem in relation to the IAC. The Victims Commissioner, Vera Baird, also resigned the letter of resignation last September, in which she also revealed there had been a number of attempts to recruit a new Victims Commissioner, but no Victims Commissioner had been announced. So the public appointments process clearly needs serious attention. It's very welcome to see that the Brown Commission report does actually venture into the territory of public appointments. On the face of it, we have these very strong human rights guarantor institutions, but they just don't have that legal underpinning that they need to be able to properly fulfil the constitutional role that they have. And that means a determined government can ignore them, can sideline them, and simply fail to reappoint them. So, very briefly, what's the solution? We've now got some very well-established standards, international standards, on what independence means for these particular types of institutions. We've got the Paris Principles on NHRIs. We've got GANRI, that's the Global Alliance for National Human Rights Institutions. They've got very detailed criteria which they apply when deciding whether they want to credit national human rights institutions as A-status institutions, which then gives them access to UN processes. And we also now have the Venice Commission Principles on Ombudsman, which again contains a very detailed elaboration of what independence requires for these types of institutions. GANRI recently, when the REHRC was reaccredited with its A status, made a number of recommendations about improving financial autonomy from the government, and also some recommendations in relation to appointments. So these are very live issues. And I think the question I just want to leave you with is whether the time has now come to try to draw up some general principles of independence for institutions. And it won't be a one-size-fits-all, because I think principles are quite important, because these principles will vary according to the type of nature of the institution. So we don't want to have a simple one-size-fits-all set of independence requirements or minimum requirements. And the Public Appointments Commission proposal, I think, is very, very important to apply that to these institutions, and possibly a statutory framework in which we could look across the piece at these different types of institutions. We would have to maybe front the definition question you can pick out, but maybe possibly a statutory framework which would enshrine the actual core minimum requirements of independence.
Thank you. Ross.
Goodness me, thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I am an accountability actor. That's how I would describe myself. I've acted in accountability roles in 5 organisations. I'm currently the chief executive of the Equality and Development Function, and have been for approaching 2 years. Before that, during COVID, I was responsible for regulating public health professionals. Before that, I spent 6.5 years as the chief executive of IPSA, which is the body that regulates MPs' pay and expenses, and was created in the wake of the expenses scandal. And before that, I was at the National Audit Office and the Audit Commission. So in all of these different roles, I've been holding people to account in ways that have been defined in different ways in the different organisations that I've been working in and more recently responsible for. I do not consider myself to be part of the fourth branch or anything like that. I don't think that's I don't think it's a concept that works, because all of these different organisations, as has been mentioned, very different in the roles that they've got to play. And one of the crucial features of them is that the people who are acting in these roles, myself and others, are accountable to democratically elected representatives, whether in government or in parliament, in the case of the United Kingdom. And that accountability is really important, because otherwise, who else should I be held to account to? So it's important that those of us who are responsible for applying the rules, establishing frameworks, being the watchdogs, are also held to account. So how can that be done? Well, the key features of these organisations, not that there's some kind of separate branch of government that is parallel, or has some kind of parallel that has a unity, because it clearly doesn't. But rather the two features that are, for me, absolutely critical, which have both been mentioned, is one about independence and one about accountability. And those two things conceptually are quite difficult to work together, because how can you be accountable to a democratic body, whether government or parliament, but also hold them to account? So this is not straightforward. And in each of the cases of these different organisations, the specifics of what they're there to do will require slightly different mechanisms by which they are held to account, and in turn, the independence that they have. The independence is crucial, and suggestions like fixed terms, the Paris principles that you mentioned already, which require the Equality and Human Rights Commission to have, in theory, report to Parliament rather than to government, to have secure funding, and so those are really important things. And much more can be done to secure the independence of these organisations. We've seen over the last decade, particularly the last 5 to 7 years, regression in the independence of many of these organisations, and some of these bodies have been brought back within government and some of their powers curtailed. The Electoral Commission is one that just springs to mind. But the independence is really important, and that's partly about the legislative framework, the statute, and all that, but it's also about the culture of the organisations and the strength of the individuals who are leading them, because it is inevitable that people who are running these organisations, whether you are running the Electoral Commission or the Equality and Human Rights Commission or any of these other actors, they will be put under pressure. Catherine Stone, who was recently the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards until December, has gone on record talking about the kinds of pressure that she was put under, personally put up against a wall virtually, pressured by MPs who didn't like the fact that she was investigating their behaviour. I have experienced that as well. In my role at IPSA, I had senior MPs banging the table at me, and one told me that he wanted me to grovel because I was asking him to pay back £34 of public money that had been misclaimed. These things happen, and so what you need is to have the structures in place to secure the independence of these organisations. But they also do need to be accountable, because we are really privileged to live in a democracy. I cherish that, and I feel myself as an accounting officer, in formal terms, that I am beholden to elected representatives for the money that I am spending, which is your money. So it's not my money. I have to account for that, and that's correct. And I need to explain to select committees why I'm choosing to spend in that particular way and not, and if I make a mistake, I have to be responsible for that. So the accountability and the independence must go hand in hand, but it will always be difficult, and it will let it come under pressure. So rather than describing these bodies as a fourth branch, I prefer the term watchdog for the reasons that you said. Watchdogs watch, bark, and bite sometimes. When I was at IPSA, I referred 6 MPs to the police. And now at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, I'm taking action against 3 government departments. The Home Office on immigration, the Department of Work and Pensions on failure to make reasonable adjustments for benefit claimants with disabilities, and the Department of Health, because they have too many people with autism and learning difficulties in institutions rather than in the community. So my organisation, which has 200 people, I'm taking action against 3 massive government departments. That's not a straightforward thing to do. And at the same time, I'm accountable to government too, according to the statute. So these are really tricky paths to tread. On illegal migration, you mentioned that. We have published a briefing that is critical of the legislation, that points out the incompatibility with human rights, but it's done in a measured way because we now I'm talking Equality and Human Rights Commission, we have to come across as authoritative so that people listen to what we're saying. And I was on the Today program last week talking about this legislation, and I was trying both to criticize the government, but to do that in a way that didn't come across as party truth, because that's the role that we're trying to play. So I much prefer the term watchdogs. I also think about these organizations as referees, because the rules are set by others. So the rules are properly set by Parliament, the government of the day, Parliament, and enforced at the kind of high level by the courts. But referees, although they don't define the rules, they manage play in a dynamic and in real time. And so, whether we're talking about cricket or tennis or football, a referee or an umpire is on the pitch with the players. People come to see the game, they don't come to see the referee, but the referee needs to be there to make everything happen fairly. And so I would like to think of these organizations as referees. I also happen to chair the Institute of Regulation, which is a UK professional body for these organizations, because, as you rightly said, sometimes the way in which regulators regulate, Ofsted, it's very heavy-handed, it's inhibiting of improvement and performance. And regulation needs to improve. There's no question about that. And regulators can learn from each other. But there are but these are organisations that are all there to enable the rules to be applied fairly, but not to set the rules themselves on the whole. But the Brown proposals are muddled, obviously, and piecemeal. And they, in ways that have already been pointed out, fail to address some of the key issues, trust, many other things besides. I do think there are improvements that have to be made. I think select committees should have a much stronger role, and I think that some of these watchdogs should have much stronger accountability to Parliament, rather than be at the beck and call of government in the way that many of them are at the moment. Some of them not even on a statutory basis. The Committee on Standards and Public Life is just one example. And I do think that there are things that can be done to hold political actors better to account for the way that they act. And in particular, I think that we've got to the stage now with social media and the way that politics is on this 24-hour cycle, that politicians get away with things in the short term, and there's no short-term mechanism for holding them to account, and that does need to be in place, in a way that the institutions that have been set up hitherto, whether the Electoral Commission or the National Government were, they were set up in a different age, and they need to be brought up to date. There are models like the Advertising Standards Authority, which has got a model where advertising needs to be objective and justifiable, and you've got to be able to vouch for what you put in an advert. Politicians are not held to the same kind of standards, and they can say what they please in the short term, and trust that nobody will really hold them to account for what they put on a bus, which obviously we've seen in practice. So there are things that can be done, and I believe that they should be done. I think that an election is obviously, whoever comes into power next is an opportunity for the new government to do something quickly, because talking about it will just mean everything runs into the sand. But I hope that sort of helped.
Not too unoptimistic after all. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Lady Hale. Well, I've been asked to make some comments about the anti-corruption commissions that exist in Australia, the comparative jurisdiction. Really just to give you a snapshot of one way in which Australia enforces the constitutional norm of probity with public administration. In the course of my remarks, I'll refer to some of the issues that have been raised by the other speakers, especially the tension between independence and accountability that Marcel has just discussed. I'll also identify measures of entrenchment that support institutional independence that Murray has spoken of as being of particular importance. And I'll say something about the constitutional status of these integrity agencies as highlighted by Eileen. So as you'll be aware, the Brown report recommended the establishment of a powerful new anti-corruption commissioner to root out criminal behaviour in British political life where it occurs. The coverage is intended to be UK-wide. The appointment of the commissioner is to meet with the approval of all the UK legislatures, and they are to report to all of the UK legislatures. They're to cooperate with the police and prosecution agencies, but they're to be independent of national and devolved governments. Now, the Brown report does not commit explicitly to any design principles in relation to the Anti-Corruption Commission. So I want to focus on three of the design principles that have proved controversial in Australia, and these may end up being debated in the United Kingdom if the Brown report recommendations are implemented. The first issue is the definition of corrupt conduct. It's implicit in the Brown report that corrupt conduct would be defined as requiring criminality. In Australia, this has been argued to be too narrow and unduly limiting. The second issue is the statutory thresholds that apply before an investigation begins and the threshold for holding public hearings. And public hearings are seen as contributing to the accountability of the institution because its processes are open to view. The third issue is the issue of the measures that are used to entrench independence, and conversely, the measures that ensure accountability through forms of oversight. So in Australia, we've had anti-corruption commissions established under statute for some time. In New South Wales, one was established in 1988. That was the first, and one might say, coming from Victoria, they probably needed it more than any other state. But in Victoria, we ultimately had one established in 2012. They now exist in all states and territories. There was no federal equivalent until the recent election of the Labor government. And the government quickly passed legislation to establish an Australia-wide National Anti-Corruption Commission, the NACC or the NAC. It commences operations in July of this year. So the first issue, this definition of corrupt conduct. Victoria's legislation adopts a definition of corrupt conduct that requires that the conduct in question would constitute a relevant criminal offence. Clearly, it has to be put in the subjunctive because this body is not a body that's determining criminal offending in itself. But the conduct and the corrupt conduct might involve such things as dishonest performance by a public official of their functions or a knowing or reckless breach of trust. But in Victoria, there'll be no investigation of that conduct and no findings of corrupt conduct unless the conduct would amount to an indictable offence against an act or a common law offence of perverting the course of justice or attempting to do so, or engaging in bribery of public official or misconduct in public office. Now, this limitation has proved to be controversial. And to give you an illustration of this, in a recent inquiry, the Victoria's Anti-Corruption Commission made findings that ministerial advisors exerted improper influence over public servants. The context was the award of a contract to health workers to deal with violence and aggression in the workplace. The contract went to a health union without an open, competitive tendering process. The health union had no relevant experience in this field, and it was not a registered training organisation. The training that was delivered was substandard, and it was delivered to very small numbers. But no finding of corrupt conduct could be made because the conduct fell short of criminality. The Commission described the conduct as another example of what it described as the phenomenon of grey corruption that is of increasing concern to integrity bodies. And soft or grey corruption involves, quote, the bending or breaking of rules, even if that might not amount to criminal behaviour, but that unfairly favours the allies, friends and networks of decision makers. It erodes standards of public governance, decision-making in the public interest and trust in government, and if left unchecked, increases the risk of corrupt criminal offending. Now, as a result of that, there have been calls to broaden Victoria's definition of corrupt conduct. But it's also the case that the Commissioner made the observation that this had come about because of the increasing centralisation of power in the Premier's private office. And I thought this might address Jake's point that the form of enforcement that's engaged in by these integrity bodies is not a simple form of enforcement. They make recommendations, and that has been regarded and absorbed as a powerful recommendation. Now, fortunately, the new federal body will be operating with the definition of corrupt conduct that does not require criminality. So moving then to the statutory thresholds for investigations in public hearings, in Victoria, for the Commission to commence an investigation, which means it can use its coercive powers as opposed to simple interviews and so on, it has to suspect on reasonable grounds that the conduct constitutes corrupt conduct. The criticism has been made that the threshold is too high, as the complaints that are received from whistleblowers usually express concerns, but they're not always supported by evidence. So as I say, the Commission can conduct preliminary inquiries, but it doesn't have available to it all of its coercive powers that it would probably need. Also, with respect to the relationship to the courts, the Victoria's Anti-Corruption Commission is subject to a legal challenge on whether there were reasonable grounds for the suspicion, and this can cause both delays and frustrate the process. Now, the investigations by the federal body, fortunately, will not depend on such a high evidentiary threshold. However, the Commonwealth Commissioner may conduct a corruption investigation only if the Commissioner is of the opinion that the issue could involve corrupt conduct that is serious or systemic. So there is another qualification on that capacity to engage in investigations. Now, with respect to the threshold for public hearings, most of the commissions throughout Australia can decide to hold public hearings. As I say, they're essential because they facilitate both accountability and transparency in respect to the conduct of public officers and in respect to the Commission itself. But in Victoria, before a public hearing can be held, the Commission must consider on reasonable grounds that there are exceptional circumstances. And the question of whether it was open to the Commission to conclude that there are reasonable grounds for concluding that the circumstances are exceptional is justiciable. So again, it's subject to a court process, and again, that can lead to delays and frustration. Now, the federal government, amid much controversy this year, ultimately adopted the same requirement of exceptional circumstances as in Victoria. And this is in addition to a requirement that the public hearing be in the public interest. So under the Federal Act, hearings must be held in private unless the Commissioner is satisfied that a public hearing would be in the public interest, taking into account whether a public examination can be held without causing unfair prejudice to a person's reputation, privacy, safety, or well-being, and that there are exceptional circumstances that justify a public hearing. So we're yet to see how rare public hearings will be at the Commonwealth level. Now, moving then to the issue of independence versus accountability. In Victoria, the independence of the Commissioner is achieved by a range of measures. The appointments made by Governor and Council on the recommendation of the Minister, but the Parliament's Integrity and Oversight Committee has the power to veto the recommendation. And this assists in what Karen has called the departisanising of these institutions. However, the Oversight Parliamentary Committee has until very recently been dominated by government members, but there was a recent acceptance within the last month by the government that the Oversight Committee would be chaired by a non-government member, and that's been regarded as a considerable advance with respect to securing the independence of the Commission. In addition, the Victorian Commissioner is an independent officer of the Parliament. And a form of entrenchment arises because the Commissioner can only be removed if both Houses of Parliament call for their removal on grounds of misbehaviour or physical or mental incapacity. So essentially the same forms of protection as applied to a judge's tenure. The Commissioner has a limited term of 5 years which can't be renewed. And again, this assists the independence of the role. With respect to accountability, the Commission in Victoria is subject to the oversight of a separate institution, the Victorian Inspectorate. And that Inspectorate is tasked with monitoring the Commission's compliance with its governing legislation and monitoring the exercise of its powers. It can receive complaints about the conduct of the Commission. For its investigating into those complaints, it has access to all of the Commission's records. It may require personnel to attend upon it, to be examined. All privileges are aggregated. It can demand the records of the Commission, especially those in relation to the coercive questioning of witnesses. It can search the Commission's premises. The Commission is obliged to fully cooperate, and the Inspectorate can recommend action be taken, including disciplinary action. So these are quite significant forms of accountability under statute. With respect to the new federal body, the independence of the federal body will be supported by a parliamentary joint committee, which it will have the power to, in fact, it has exercised that power to accept a nomination by the Minister for the appointment of the Commissioner. It has the power to accept or reject. The Commissioner will have a limited term of 5 years and no renewal, and the Commissioner's tenure can only be terminated on the restricted grounds that I mentioned before, on petition by both Houses of Parliament. With respect to the accountability of the federal body, there'll be an oversight by a parliamentary joint committee on the National Anti-Corruption Commission. This will monitor and review the performance of the Commission of its functions. That body will report to both Houses of Parliament. It will also report to Parliament on any matter arising out of any investigation report by the Commission. It will also, and I think this is a novel feature, it will review the Commission's budget and finances and report to the Parliament on whether the Commission has sufficient resources. However, the chair of that joint committee must be a member of the government, and they can exercise a casting vote if votes are equal. The oversight of the body also includes a separate institution, namely an inspector, whose function it is to detect corrupt conduct within and relating to the Commission itself, or complaints of maladministration. And that inspector is an independent officer of the Commonwealth Parliament with a 10-year term and no renewal. So by way of sort of concluding remarks, I've really just given you some indication of the statutory features that's provided at the state and federal level for both the independence and accountability of anti-corruption commissions. None of the legislation provides for double entrenchment. There's no requirement for a special majority for repeal. So the forms of entrenchment of the commissions that I've identified I would describe as modest. In my opinion, these bodies lack the constitutional status that would render them guarantor institutions. And it's perhaps the requirement for accountability of these institutions in a democracy that prevents them standing outside of the ordinary framework of governmental institutions. That is, it prevents them from being a fourth branch of government. And I think Marcel, in effect, made the same point, that it's all of those stringent measures of accountability that make these integrity bodies simply really another regulatory executive body. They're subject to the ordinary restraints governing the exercise of executive power, namely judicial review by the courts, reports to Parliament, and examination by other executive bodies that monitor the performance of their statutory powers. So I really share Eileen's and Marcial's view, and I think possibly Murray's view, that at least with respect to anti-corruption commissions of the type I've described, they're neither guarantor nor fourth branch institutions. Rather, they sit within a well-recognised category of executive regulatory bodies. Their distinctive character is that they engage in the essential work of detecting and preventing conduct that adversely affects the honest and impartial exercise of the public officials' powers, duties, and functions. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to all the members of the panel for their incredibly helpful contributions to this debate. I would have thought those who've been writing the Brown Commission report should have been making very careful notes. So, questions? Yes, Tara. Oh, well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And can we say a big thank you to the members of the panel? A great job on what I happen to think, I still think, is probably the most practicable set of things to think about in this whole report, important though the whole thing is. But I want also to say a big thank you to the organisers. Well, Taryn, who's done an awful lot of work on it, I know. Zaki, who's been working hard on communications generally. And I'm glad to see that Elliot thinks that he couldn't have read it better himself. That's delightful. And of course, to the Institute for setting the whole thing up. So thank you, Kate, very much indeed.
So Baroness Hill has said many of the thank yous that I wanted to say, but to thank you all for attending today. I think that should be the beginning of a conversation, which is certainly what we think the report asks us to do. And to all of the people who've come, it's been absolutely fantastic, a really great set of panel discussions, questions from the floor. To remind all of you that at 5:30 this evening, there will be a lecture in this very room by Baroness Hale, who'll be in conversation with Robert Spano, the immediate past president of the European Court of Human Rights, which will be moderated by Helen Mountfield, who's the principal of Mansfield College. So please feel free to stay. And frankly, if you've got seats now, I wouldn't vacate them because I know that it's somewhat oversubscribed. But otherwise, just for the rest to say thank you very much. Thank you, Zaki, in particular, and to Rosie, and of course, my colleague, Taryn.